Stop loving me." Nora Ellison grabbed Clayton Barron's hand and pressed it away from her face, her voice cracking on every word. Texas's most powerful cowboy had ridden through gunfire drought and stampedes without flinching. But when this widow looked him straight in the eye and begged him to forget her, Clayton felt something inside his chest collapse that no bullet had ever touched. He had built an empire on fear. He had no idea what to do with love. If this is your first time here, subscribe to our channel and ring that bell so you never miss a story. Drop a comment right now and tell us what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story has traveled. The trouble started with a broken fence and a burned brand, and it ended up costing Clayton Barron something he hadn't known he still possessed. 10 weeks before, Nora whispered those 4 words that changed everything. Cedar Wells was baking under a July sun so merciless. It turned the road between Long Spur Ranch and the Ellison property into something that shimmered and wavered like a mirage. Clayton had ridden that road 1,000 times in the 2 years since Daniel Ellison died and left his widow to manage a modest farm on the wrong side of that dust. He had noticed her, of course. A man with Clayton's instincts noticed everything. But noticing and concerning himself were 2 entirely separate things, and for 22 months he had kept them that way. How was the wealthiest rancher in 3 counties? He led the Cedar Wells Cattlemen's Association with the kind of authority that made other men choose their words carefully before they opened their mouths. Long Spur Ranch ran over 4,000 head, employed 31 cowboys, and held a railroad shipping contract that smaller operations would have surrendered 10 years of profit to touch. Clayton had not built that by allowing sentiment to complicate his decisions. Howe was also 36 years old alone in a house with 11 rooms and had not sat at a dinner table with anyone he genuinely respected in longer than he cared to calculate. But none of that was on his mind when Abel McRae rode up to the main house at 6:45 in the morning and informed him that 14 Long Spur cattle had pushed through the south boundary fence and were currently spread across the neighboring property. "How bad's the fence?" Clayton asked, already pulling on his boots. "Rotten post gave way," Abel said. He was 55, leather-faced, and had been Long Spur's foreman since before Clayton inherited the operation. He was one of approximately 4 people alive who could say something Clayton didn't want to hear without regretting it. "Third time this season. You want me to handle the retrieval? I'll go myself." Clayton stood and reached for his hat. "Last thing I need is the widow claiming we let her property get trampled and then sending some lawyer into town on my account." Abel's expression did not change, but something shifted in his eyes. "She's not that kind of woman." "Every kind of person is capable of becoming that kind of person when money is involved." Abel didn't argue. He had learned which battles were worth the energy. Clayton rode the quarter-mile in under 4 minutes, prepared to find a frightened woman standing on her porch, wringing her hands while his cattle destroyed her kitchen garden. He had a speech ready, civil, efficient, slightly apologetic in tone, but careful not to imply genuine fault. He would offer to pay for any trampled crops, have his men repair the fence within the hour, and be back on his own land before the morning got any hotter. What he found instead stopped him at the gate. Nora Ellison was not standing on her porch. She was in the middle of her yard, and she had already separated 11 of the 14 animals into the far corner near her barn. She moved with a calm that Clayton had only ever seen in experienced hands. Not chasing, not startling, just steady pressure at the right angle. Reading the animals, the way a person reads a familiar page. She wore a pale blue work dress that had been washed so many times the color had softened to something almost gray, and her chestnut hair was pinned up in the practical way of a woman who had stopped worrying about appearances before a working day started. She didn't look up when he dismounted and came through the gate. She was watching the remaining 3 cattle tracking their movement, and she held one hand low and open at her side, the way a person does when they want to communicate to a nervous animal that the hand contains nothing threatening. "3 more over by the water trough," she said without turning. "The one on the left has a cut on his foreleg. Looks like wire. Not deep, but it'll need cleaning." Clayton stopped walking. He stood there for a moment that lasted longer than he expected. "You separated them yourself," he said. "They were frightened. Frightened cattle do damage. It seemed smarter to deal with it than to wait." She glanced back at him. Then briefly those hazel eyes measuring him with the same calm efficiency she had applied to his cattle. "I'm assuming you're Clayton Barron." "I am. Your fence post rotted out. The third one from the cottonwood at the property corner. You might want to replace the two on either side of it as well, since they'll go the same way before winter." He didn't have an immediate response to that. In his experience, a conversation that began with a woman giving him practical maintenance advice about his own property was unusual enough to require a moment of recalibration. "I appreciate that," he said finally. "I'm not doing it for appreciation. I'm doing it because another fence failure means more of your cattle in my yard, and I have enough to manage without that." She moved toward the water trough, still watching the three loose animals, still maintaining that low, steady posture. "Come from the right. They're calmer if the pressure comes from that direction." He came from the right. They worked the remaining three into the corner together, without speaking for several minutes, and Clayton noticed something he didn't expect to notice. She was good at this. Not adequate. Not capable for a woman. Genuinely skilled with the kind of knowledge that came from years of actual practice, rather than observation from a safe distance. She read the animal's body language the way experienced hands did, adjusting her position before they moved, rather than reacting after. "You worked cattle before," he said. "I worked beside my husband for 7 years." Her voice was even. Daniel wasn't much for dividing labor by who wore trousers. Clayton didn't respond to that. He wasn't sure what response would have been appropriate, and he had a general policy against speaking when he wasn't sure. Once the animals were contained against the barn wall, Nora crossed to the injured steer and crouched to examine the foreleg wound with steady hands. Clayton watched her run her fingers carefully along the cut, checking for debris. "It needs cleaning and some salve," she said. "I have both. I can have one of my men." "I'll do it. It won't take 10 minutes." She stood and moved toward the barn without waiting for his response. Clayton stood with his cattle and his thoughts both slightly rearranged from where they'd been an hour ago. She came back with a tin of salve and a clean cloth, and she worked on the steer's leg with a competence that made Clayton feel for a strange moment like the unnecessary party in this situation. He had ridden over here expecting to manage a problem. Instead, the problem had already been managed by someone who apparently needed him the way a person needs a second lantern in full daylight. It was while she was treating the cut that she paused, her hand stilled on the steer's leg, and she leaned slightly closer to the animal's flank. "Mr. Barron," she said quietly. Something in her tone changed. Not alarm exactly, but a shift in weight, the voice of a person who has found something they were not looking for, and is taking a careful moment to understand what it means. "What is it? Come look at this brand." He crouched beside her. The long spur mark was there, his iron, his registration, everything correct. But underneath it, just barely visible at the edge where the hair had grown back unevenly, was the ghost of another mark. Older. Applied first, then burned over. High new brands. He had registered his first one at 19 years old, and had spent the 17 years since learning to read them, the way a banker reads a ledger. The shape under the long spur mark was faint, but it was there, and it was unmistakable once you knew what you were looking at. It was the Ellison brand. The silence between them stretched for a full 10 seconds. "That's your husband's mark," Clayton said. "Yes." Nora stood slowly. Her voice had not changed, but her hands had. She folded them in front of her, a careful, deliberate gesture. "Underneath yours." Clayton straightened. His mind was already working, already sorting implications with the practiced speed of a man who had navigated 17 years of business disputes, legal contests, and county politics. A long spur animal carrying a prior Ellison brand underneath. The Ellison mark had been dormant since Daniel's death, which meant someone had applied it, then covered it, or had applied long spur over it at a specific moment and for a specific reason. "This animal came off my range," he said. He was not asking. "Your fence, your cattle, your brand on top." She looked at him directly. "But my husband's brand was there first." The implication hung between them like smoke. "Do you know what it means?" he asked. "I know what it could mean." She didn't look away. "And I know what people in this town will assume it means before they ask a single question." She was right about that. Cedar Wells was not a community that rewarded careful thinking when a simpler story was available. A widow whose husband had died under ambiguous circumstances and now stolen cattle, carrying the dead man's ghost brand, were turning up on her property. That was a story that told itself, and it told itself in the worst possible way. "Did your husband have dealings with anyone at Long Spur?" Clayton asked. "Daniel had dealings with half the county. He was a broker before he was a rancher." She paused. "I don't know the specifics of his final year. He kept things from me. I've spent 2 years trying to decide whether that was to protect me or to protect himself." "Did he keep records?" Something shifted in her expression. A consideration, a calculation, not of whether to trust him, but of what trusting him would cost her. "He kept a livestock ledger," she said finally. "It's coded. I've never been able to read most of it." "Coded how?" "Notches in the margin. Different ink colors. Brand sketches drawn reversed or partial." She watched his face as she said it. He was careful. Whatever he was doing or not doing, he was careful about who could follow it. Clayton looked at the cattle. He looked at the brand. He looked at Nora Ellison, who was watching him with those steady hazel eyes, and who had not in the course of this entire conversation asked him for a single thing. "I'd like to see the ledger," he said. "I imagined you might. Not to use against you, to understand what we're looking at." She studied him for a moment. "Most powerful man in 3 counties, and the first thing you say when you find a dead man's brand on your cattle is that you want to see the records." She tilted her head slightly. "What does that tell me?" "It tells you I'd rather know the truth than be surprised by it later." She considered that. Then she nodded once, the kind of nod that meant something. "Come inside," she said. "I'll put coffee on." The ledger was a plain brown book, battered at the corners and thickened from years of use. Nora set it on the kitchen table between them and opened it without ceremony, and Clayton spent the next 40 minutes studying the most deliberately obscured cattle record he had ever encountered. Daniel Ellison had been thorough. Every entry carried at least 2 layers of encoding the obvious surface notation that recorded ordinary sales and transfers, and beneath that, a second layer, readable only if you knew the system. Ink color indicated origin. Notch position indicated whether a transaction was recorded voluntarily or under some form of pressure. The reversed brand sketches, Clayton realized slowly, were not errors. They were the actual brands the animals had been carrying before someone changed them. "How wasn't recording his own operations," Clayton said. He said it quietly, almost to himself. "No." Nora's voice was careful. "He was recording someone else's." The kitchen was still except for the sound of a fly against the window glass. Outside, the summer heat pressed against the walls of the house, and somewhere in the yard, one of the cattle shifted and settled. "Did he tell you he was doing this?" "He told me things were complicated and that I shouldn't worry." She looked at the ledger with an expression that had sadness in it, but not sentimentality. "I asked him once, about 6 months before he died, whether we had a legal problem. He said no. He said he was handling it." She was quiet for a moment. "He was wrong about the handling it part." Clayton turned pages slowly, reading the coding system as it became clearer to him, and a picture assembled itself that he did not like. Cattle moving in small groups. Transfers recorded before the official receipt dates. Brands altered between source and delivery. Enough volume spread over enough time to represent a significant ongoing operation, not a desperate one-time theft, but something organized, sustained, and protected by someone with sufficient influence to keep it quiet. "There are names hidden in here," he said. "I've found partial ones, initials mostly." She pointed to a series of entries near the back. "This pattern repeats 17 times over 2 years, same routing, same timing." He looked where she was pointing. His pulse did something he didn't acknowledge. "Do you know whose initials those are?" he asked. "I wasn't certain until this morning." She met his eyes. "Are you?" Clayton looked at the letters on the page. HC repeated 17 times, connected to routing patterns that matched Long Spur's primary shipping broker. Harlan Creed, the man who had brokered his cattle deals for 11 years. The man who had attended his father's funeral and stood at the graveside with his hat in his hands, and spoken about loyalty in the way that people speak about loyalty when they mean to invoke it as a shield. The man who had 3 weeks ago introduced Clayton to the railroad representatives and assured him that the new contract would be the foundation of Long Spur's next decade. Clayton set the ledger down. He sat with what he had just seen, and he felt the specific, unpleasant sensation of a very important thing rearranging itself inside his understanding of his own life. "You knew," he said, not accusing, asking. "I suspected. I needed someone with enough access to his records to confirm it." She folded her hands on the table. Her voice was level, but her eyes had something in them that cost her to hold steady. "I couldn't walk into the Cattlemen's Association and ask questions. I couldn't go to the sheriff without being arrested first and questioned second. So you waited. I managed my farm. I raised my fences. I kept my head down, and I waited for something to break, the way it broke this morning." She looked at him directly. "A man's cattle don't wander onto the wrong property carrying the wrong ghost brand unless someone made an error, and errors are how operations like this one eventually end." Clayton studied her face. The exhaustion in it that she carried quietly, the way a person carries a heavy thing they've learned to balance. The intelligence in her eyes that she didn't hide and didn't advertise. The stillness of someone who had been frightened for a long time and had made a decision not to let the fear show. "What do you want from me?" he asked. "Access. And the willingness to follow where the evidence leads, even if you don't like where it goes. And if it leads somewhere that implicates people I've trusted." She didn't hesitate. "Then we follow it anyway." He looked at the ledger. He looked at the woman across the table from him. He thought about Harlan Creed and 11 years of business and a railroad contract that was supposed to secure Long Spur's future. And he thought about 14 cattle carrying a dead man's ghost brand, pushed through a rotted fence post on an early July morning. "All right," he said. Nora exhaled barely, almost nothing, but he caught it. 2 years of carrying this alone, and she had just set the first corner of it down. "One condition," she said. "Name it." "If the evidence condemns my husband, we follow it anyway." The words hit him harder than he expected, because he understood exactly what they cost her. She wasn't asking for protection. She wasn't asking for the ledger to be quietly buried somewhere it would never surface. She was asking him to promise that the truth would be worth more than her comfort, and she was making that demand of herself first. "Agreed," he said. She nodded. She stood to pour more coffee. Her hands were completely steady. 3 days later, the county sheriff rode out to Nora's property. He was not there for a courtesy call. 2 more altered cattle had been found in the creek bed at the edge of the Ellison property, not inside the fence line, but close enough that the association between the location and the widow was immediate and damaging. The brands told the same story as the first Long Spur, overlaid on Ellison, both marks clear to anyone who looked carefully. Word traveled the way. Word traveled in Cedar Wells, which was fast and unkind. By the time Clayton heard it, half the town had already assembled the narrative. Daniel Ellison had been rustling Long Spur cattle before his death, and his widow had continued the operation. The evidence was there, wasn't it? Right there on the animals, right there on her land. Clayton was in the mercantile when Esther Bell told him what was being said. Esther was 61, owned the building and 3/4 of what was in it, and had lived in Cedar Wells long enough to have formed reliable opinions about the reliability of people's opinions. "They're saying she's been at it since Daniel died," Esther said, keeping her voice low. "That the accident wasn't an accident at all, that he got caught doing it, and she's been running it alone ever since. That's a significant amount of conclusion drawing from 2 dead men's brands on a creek bank," Clayton said. "This town doesn't require much encouragement for conclusions." Esther looked at him with the particular directness of someone who has watched a situation developing and has an opinion about where it's heading. "What are you going to do?" Clayton bought the nails he had come for and thought about it on the ride home. The practical answer was simple. He had a railroad contract to protect, and an association presidency that depended on the support of men who were already forming opinions. The cleanest path was to let the sheriff's investigation run its course, express appropriate concern about the brand alterations as a matter of operational security, and allow public suspicion to settle where it seemed to be settling. Nora Ellison would have no way to defend herself without access to Daniel's ledger, and the ledger alone wasn't enough without corroborating records from Harlan's shipping operations. She would almost certainly be charged. She might be convicted. Long Spur would be insulated. The railroad contract would be safe, and Harlan Creed would close his books and move his operations somewhere else before anyone looked too carefully at his accounts. Clayton pulled his horse to a stop in the middle of the road between his gate and hers. He sat there in the full heat of the afternoon for a long moment. Then he turned and rode to her door. She answered on his second knockflower on her hands from bread she'd been making because her world was ending by reputation in the town square, and she was still making bread because the bread still needed making. "They're saying you're responsible for the brands on those animals," he said. "I've heard what they're saying. Sheriff's going to want to talk to you again before the week is out." "I know." He looked at her. She looked at him. Neither of them pretended the situation was anything other than exactly what it was. "I want to propose a formal agreement," he said. "You give me access to Daniel's full ledger. I give you access to Long Spur's shipping records for the past 3 years. We work together to document what Harlan Creed has been doing, and we bring it to the association with evidence solid enough that they can't look away from it." Nora was quiet for a moment. The flower on her hands was the most ordinary detail in an entirely unordinary situation. "You're risking your contract," she said. "If this goes wrong, Harlan will use it to take the association presidency. He's already building the case." "Yes." "You understand that helping me could cost you everything you've built." "I understand it." "Then why?" He thought about the 14 cattle separated calmly into a corner by a woman in a worn pale blue dress. He thought about the ledger with its 17 sets of initials. He thought about 2 years of a widow managing her land and her grief and her dangerous secret alone, making bread, because the bread still needed making. "Because you already know the truth," he said. "And the truth is going to come out one way or another. I'd rather it came out on the right side." She studied him for a long moment. The calculation in her eyes was not cynical, it was careful. The evaluation of a person who had learned that trust is a thing you extend at measurable cost, and who was deciding in real time what this cost was worth. "There's a name in that ledger," she said finally. "The first full name that appears connected to the earliest entries before the coding gets heavier." She paused. "It isn't Harlan Creed." Clayton waited. "It's a payment authorization," she said, "signed by someone who had authority over the northern shipment routes 3 years ago." She met his eyes steadily. "The signature is witnessed, and the witness is Harlan Creed's station clerk." His jaw tightened slightly. "But the name on the authorization," he said carefully, "was someone who at that time held the position that gives them routing authority over every Long Spur shipment from Cedar Wells to the railhead." She held his gaze. "The name is Clayton Barron." The silence that followed was absolute. Clayton stood on her porch with the afternoon heat pressing in from all directions, and he looked at Nora Ellison's face, and he understood what she had just told him. Not that he was guilty, but that someone had made certain that if this investigation ever found daylight, it would find his name on the oldest page. Not Harlan's name first, his. "He planned for this," Clayton said. His voice was very quiet. "He's been planning for this for 3 years." Nora's voice was equally quiet, but there was something in it now, something that might have been sympathy, or might have been the shared recognition of 2 people who have just understood the full dimension of the problem facing them. "He made Daniel keep the early records. When Daniel tried to withdraw, Harlan made sure the records pointed backward to people who couldn't defend themselves. A dead man. And you." Clayton's hands were still at his sides. He was not a man who showed what was happening inside him, but Nora was watching carefully enough to see the slight change in his expression. Not fear exactly. Something more controlled than fear. The face of a man recalibrating. "If we stop now," he said, "it doesn't matter." She finished the sentence for him. "He'll use what he has regardless. The question was never whether this was going to get dangerous. The question is whether we let him tell the story, or whether we do." Clayton looked out at the road between their properties. His road and her road really, since they faced each other across it, his empire and her survival separated by 40 feet of summer dust. "All right," he said for the second time in 3 days. But this time, his voice had something different in it. Not agreement. Commitment. "I need 2 days to organize the ledger's second layer," she said. "And I need access to your railroad receipts from the northern route. All of them. Not the summaries, the originals. You'll have them by tomorrow morning." She nodded. She looked back over her shoulder at the kitchen where the bread was still waiting. "Mr. Barron," she said. "Clayton." A pause. Not a long one, but deliberate. "Clayton," she said. "Whatever we find in those records, whatever Daniel did or didn't do, I need you to understand something. Tell me. I will not protect his reputation at the expense of the truth. If he was as deep in this as those early entries suggest, I will say so. Publicly, if necessary." Her voice was steady, and her eyes were steadier. "I loved my husband. But love doesn't make a man innocent, and I will not stand up in front of Cedar Wells and lie for a dead man, not even one I grieve." Clayton looked at her for a long moment. "That," he said, "is the most honest thing anyone has said to me in 11 years of business." She almost smiled. Almost. "Don't make too much of it," she said. "It might just be that I'm too tired for anything else." She went back inside to her bread. Clayton stood on the porch for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and then he walked back to his horse, and as he mounted, he noticed something he had no particular framework for noticing. The road between their properties was 40 feet wide. He was already looking forward to crossing it again tomorrow. The originals were waiting on her gate post before sunrise. Nora found them at 5:30 in the morning when she went out to check her chickens, a leather-wrapped bundle of railroad receipts. Every northern route shipment from Long Spur, for the past 36 months, organized by date and tied with a piece of string. No note, no explanation. She carried them inside and spent the next 6 hours at the kitchen table, cross-referencing them against Daniel's coded entries. And by the time the afternoon heat had settled fully into the house, she had found what she had been afraid she would find. The timing was wrong in 23 shipments. Not dramatically wrong, not the kind of wrong that would jump out at a casual examiner. A day here, a day there. Cattle recorded as arriving at the railhead before Long Spur's books showed them leaving the ranch, or leaving the ranch before Harlan's receipts acknowledged receiving them. Small gaps, careful gaps, the kind that only became visible when you held the two sets of records side by side and looked at the space between them. The space between them was where the stolen cattle lived. She was still at the table when Clayton knocked at 3 in the afternoon. She opened the door and didn't say good afternoon or ask him how his day had gone. She simply stepped back and let him in and pointed at the table. He sat down across from her and looked at what she had laid out. He didn't speak for several minutes. He turned pages, aligned dates, moved between the two sets of records with the focused quiet of someone doing math they are not going to enjoy the answer to. 23 shipments, he said finally. That I can confirm. There may be more where the gap was closed in a way I can't track. The volume of cattle. At current market rates, somewhere between... She paused. Enough. More than enough. He sat back in his chair. He rubbed his jaw, once a short, restless gesture that she had not seen from him before, and she filed it away as the face of Clayton Barron when he is angry and is being careful about it. He's been doing this for 3 years, Clayton said. Under my name, using my receipts, on my contract. Yes. And Daniel found it. Daniel helped him start it. Then Daniel found his conscience, which turned out to be the most dangerous thing Daniel Ellison ever discovered. She looked at her hands on the table. He was trying to build a record detailed enough that it couldn't be ignored. He was planning to go to the association. He told me a month before he died that he had something important to resolve, that when it was resolved, things would be cleaner. He didn't tell you what it was. He said knowing would put me in danger. Her voice didn't waver, but something in it cost her. He was right about that part. His death, Clayton said carefully. The official account is a riding accident. She met his eyes. Daniel had ridden the same trail to the eastern pasture every week for 4 years. He knew that trail the way he knew his own hands. The kitchen was very quiet. We need Harlan's private shipping books, Clayton said. Yes. He keeps them at the stockyard office. He won't give them voluntarily. No. Which means we need something to bring to the association that doesn't depend on his cooperation. He thought for a moment. The station clerk. You said the earliest authorization was witnessed by his station clerk. A man named Abe Fowler. He's been with Harlan 8 years. People who witness things for 8 years either believe in what they're witnessing, Clayton said, or they eventually get tired of it. Nora looked at him. Something in her expression shifted, not softening exactly, but acknowledging. The slight recalibration of a person who has been working alone and has just found unexpectedly that she is not working alone anymore. You think he might talk, she said. I think a man who's been keeping a secret for 8 years has been wanting to put it down for at least 7. Clayton stood. Let me find out. He was at the door when she spoke. Clayton. He turned. She was still at the table, surrounded by the evidence of a conspiracy that had cost her husband his life and her 2 years of isolated survival, and she looked tired in the bone-deep way of someone who has been carrying weight in the dark for too long. Thank you, she said. Not for helping me, for believing the ledger. He held her gaze for a moment. Thank you, he said, for making bread while your world was falling apart. It made me think you were the kind of person worth trusting. He left before she could answer. But as he rode back up the road toward Long Spur, he was thinking about her hands steady on that flour-dusted table, and he already knew with the same instinct that had built him an empire and kept him alive through 17 years of hard business, that the 40 feet between their properties was going to keep getting harder to maintain. He was right about that. He was right about that in ways he wasn't anywhere near ready for yet. Clayton found Abe Fowler the next morning at the feed store doing the kind of errand that a man does when he wants to appear ordinary. Fowler was 53, thin in the shoulders, with the careful eyes of someone who had spent years watching what he said and where he said it. He nodded when Clayton walked in. He did not look surprised to see him, which itself told Clayton something. Walk with me, Clayton said. He didn't make it a question. They walked to the far end of the lot, where the lumber was stacked away from the counter, and the 2 other men comparing seed prices near the door. Clayton stood with his back to the street and looked at Fowler directly the way he looked at men when he needed them to understand that the conversation was going to cost something, no matter which direction it went. You witnessed a payment authorization 3 years ago, Clayton said. Northern Route, early summer. The signature on the authorization was mine, but I didn't sign it. Fowler's jaw tightened. A small movement, almost nothing but Clayton had spent 17 years reading men across tables and across herds and across the kind of disputed fences that ended in lawsuits, and he did not miss it. I don't know what you're referring to, Fowler said. You do. Clayton kept his voice level. And you've known for 3 years that you were holding something that was eventually going to demand a decision from you. I'm telling you that the decision is here now, and I'm asking you to make the right one. Fowler said nothing. He looked at the lumber stack as though it contained something deeply interesting. Daniel Ellison kept records, Clayton said. His widow has them. They're detailed enough to rebuild the entire operation from the first altered brand to the most recent shipment. What they don't have yet is a living witness who was present for the beginning of it. He paused. You were present. A man in my position who talks about a man like Harlan Creed tends to find himself in difficult circumstances, Fowler said quietly. A man in your position who stays silent while this unravels is going to find himself in worse ones. Clayton let that sit for a moment. I'm not offering you safety, I can't guarantee. I'm telling you the truth about where this is heading and giving you the chance to be on the right side of it when it gets there. Fowler finally looked at him. The careful eyes had something in them now that was tired in the way of a man who has been carrying something heavy across a long distance and has just been shown a place to set it down. I need time, Fowler said. You have until Friday. Clayton walked back to his horse and rode toward Long Spur without looking back. He had said what needed saying. The rest was Fowler's own conscience to manage, and in Clayton's experience, a conscience that had been quiet for 3 years, tended to get loud very quickly once it was given permission. He was halfway home when he made a decision that surprised even himself. He turned the horse south instead of north and rode to Nora's gate. She was at the fence line checking posts, moving methodically from one to the next, testing each one with both hands, the way you test something you've learned not to trust. She looked up when she heard him. "Fowler is thinking about it," Clayton said. She nodded slowly. "How long?" "Friday. 3 days." "What did you offer him?" "The truth. That what's coming is going to reach him regardless, and being honest about what he witnessed is the only version of this where he comes out with anything intact." Nora was quiet for a moment, testing another post, her hands firm and measured. That's either going to work very well or not at all. Usually how those conversations go. He dismounted without being asked, because staying on the horse while she worked seemed wrong in a way he didn't entirely know how to explain. He walked to the next post and tested it himself, and she watched him do it without commenting. "This one needs replacing." "I know. I've got 2 more like it on the east line." She moved to the next. "I found something else in the ledger last night." "Tell me." Daniel noted specific dates when cattle were removed from holding pens and moved to secondary locations before the official transfer paperwork was processed. The gap was always between 12 and 36 hours. Long enough to alter the brand and let it set before the animal was presented for inspection, short enough that nobody looking at the official timeline would notice the window. She paused. "The secondary locations are listed in the coded entries. 3 of them are on land I don't recognize. One of them is the old Hartley holding pen off the northern road." "That pen's been empty for 4 years, Clayton said. "According to Harlan's official records, yes." Their eyes met. Clayton felt the specific, unpleasant sensation of a puzzle piece settling into a place that made the picture worse rather than better. "He's been using it," Clayton said. "The entry dates suggest it was active as recently as 8 weeks ago." 8 weeks ago, Clayton had been preparing the final terms of the railroad contract. Harlan had been at his elbow for every meeting, helpful and familiar, speaking about loyalty in the way he always spoke about loyalty. "I want to ride out to the Hartley pen," Clayton said. "So do I." Nora said it without hesitation. "Tomorrow morning early." He looked at her. She looked back at him with the steady patience of someone who has already made the decision and is simply waiting for the other person to catch up. "It could be dangerous," he said. "My husband investigated this alone and didn't tell me." Her voice was even, but there was something underneath it with an edge. "I'm not repeating that model." He nodded. There was nothing in the logic of that sentence to argue with. 5 o'clock, he said. "I'll have the wagon ready." She raised an eyebrow. "I have my own wagon." "I know you do. I'll have mine ready and you can drive yours, and we'll have 2 wagons and double the chance of getting whatever's in that pen back here safely." He paused. "Or you can take mine and I'll drive yours if you have a preference." Nora looked at him for a long moment with an expression he couldn't entirely read. Then she turned back to the fence post. 5 o'clock, she said. He mounted and rode home, and he did not examine too carefully why he was already planning the morning's route with the particular thoroughness he usually reserved for operations that mattered. The Hartley pen the next morning told a story that neither of them wanted to read, and both of them needed to. Clayton had brought 2 of his most trusted handsmen who had been with Long Spur for over a decade, and who understood without being told explicitly that what they found that morning was not for general discussion. Nora came in her wagon with the coded ledger entries she had copied onto a separate sheet, her handwriting neat and precise, every notation cross-referenced. What the pen contained was evidence of sustained and sophisticated operation. Branding equipment. Medication for keeping stressed animals calm during the alteration process. A wooden rack for restraining cattle during the brand work. And in the corner, hanging from a nail with the casual confidence of someone who never expected anyone to look, a set of railroad tags, pre-numbered, matching a sequence that Nora found in Daniel's ledger within 4 minutes of looking. She stood holding the tags, and she didn't speak for a moment. Clayton watched her face move through something he recognized as the specific grief of a person who has had a suspicion confirmed, and discovers that confirmation is not actually easier than uncertainty. "He came here," she said quietly. "Daniel came here and documented this. These tag numbers are in his ledger with dates and quantities." She looked up. and he still couldn't find a way to get out. Harlan had too much on him by then, Clayton said. Once a man's helped alter one brand, the second brand is easier to threaten him with than the first. He should have told me. Yes. She looked at him, and he didn't offer her comfort. He didn't know how to give, because she wasn't asking for comfort. She was acknowledging a truth about her marriage, that she had probably spent 2 years refusing to look at directly, and looking at it now clearly, because the alternative was to keep carrying it indefinitely. "We take the tags," she said. "And the equipment. Is there anything here with Harlan's name or mark?" One of Clayton's hands called out from the far corner of the pen. He had found a leather-bound receipt book tucked behind a loose plank with Harlan Creed's name printed on the cover and his initials stamped into the leather. Nora crossed the pen and opened it. Clayton stood beside her, and they read it together, and the receipt book was the kind of document that would have ended the conversation immediately, except that every entry in it was coded in a system different from Daniel's. Harlan's own coding. Numbers and abbreviations that meant nothing to either of them. "We need someone who knows his system," Clayton said. "Or we need Fowler," Nora said. They looked at each other. "Friday," Clayton said. "Friday." They loaded everything into the wagons and rode back to Long Spur under a sky that was turning white with heat. And when they got there, Clayton showed Nora his shipping records room, a long narrow space off the main office lined with wooden filing boxes organized by year and route. He watched her move through it with the focused efficiency of someone who has learned to work quickly in spaces where she might not be welcome. Long pulling specific boxes. Cross-referencing dates. Her lips moving slightly when she read the way people do when they're encoding information into memory rather than just scanning it. She did not ask permission to pull a box. She also did not take anything she hadn't named in advance. Clayton noticed both things. Abel McRae appeared in the doorway at mid-morning with coffee and the carefully neutral expression of a man observing a situation he has opinions about and is choosing to express through hospitality rather than commentary. "Mrs. Ellison," he said, handing her a cup. "Mr. McRae." She accepted it without breaking her concentration on the file in her hand. Abel handed Clayton his cup and gave him a look that contained approximately 3 separate and complete thoughts without using a single word. Clayton received all 3 and chose to ignore 2 of them. "Anything from the South Range this morning?" Clayton asked. "Quiet," Abel said. "Harlan's man came by about an hour ago. Said Harlan wanted to know if you were available to discuss the railroad schedule this week. Tell him Thursday." "You're busy Thursday." "I know." Abel accepted this without expression and left. Nora looked up from the file she was reading. "His man came to check on you," she said. "Yes." "Harlan knows something is moving." She set the file down and looked at him directly. "He's been watching you long enough to know your patterns. If you change them, he'll notice." "I know." "You need to appear as if nothing is different. Meet with him. Let him tell you what he wants to tell you. Don't ask questions he isn't expecting." Clayton looked at her. "You've thought about this before." "I've had 2 years to think about most things." She picked up the next file. "When is the association meeting?" 2 weeks. "That's our deadline then." She didn't look up. "If we can't build a complete account by the association meeting, Harlan controls the story. And if he controls the story before we have the evidence organized..." She stopped. "I know," Clayton said. "Do you understand what happens to me if we're not ready?" "Yes." He said it plainly without softening it, because she wasn't asking him to soften it. "You take the blame for what Daniel started and Harlan finished, and I lose the railroad contract because Harlan poisons the relationship before we can expose him. And Cedar Wells gets the version of this story that Harlan wrote 3 years ago when he built the forgeries into the routing records." She looked up at him then. The expression on her face was something he hadn't seen from her yet, not quite surprise, but a close relative of it. The face of someone who expected to have to explain something difficult and found that they didn't need to. "Yes," she said. "Exactly that." "Then we need to be ready," he said. "So let's be ready." She looked at him for a moment longer than was conversational. Then she turned back to the files and kept working, and Clayton sat across the table from her and opened his own set of records and began cross-referencing the dates she had already flagged. And for 2 hours, the shipping records room held nothing but the sound of papers turning and two people working with the specific focused quiet of those who have found a common purpose and are running toward it. It was the most useful morning Clayton had spent in longer than he could immediately remember. What neither of them saw was Harlan Creed's man still sitting his horse at the far tree line, where he had a clean line of sight to the main house, watching the widow's wagon parked in Clayton Barron's yard at mid-morning, and writing something small in a small notebook before he turned his horse and rode back toward town. The first indication that Harlan was moving faster than they anticipated came 2 days later. Clayton was at the stockyard for a routine inspection when 3 association members stopped him in a group, not by accident, by arrangement. The way men arrange casual conversations when they want deniability for the substance of them. Walt Pruitt, who ran the second-largest cattle operation in the county. George Kimball, who owned the bank. And Curtis Lane, who held the Southern Road contracts and had been Harlan Creed's closest social acquaintance for 15 years. "There's concern in the association," Pruitt said with the careful tone of a man delivering a message he's been rehearsed on. "About the widow Ellison." "What kind of concern?" Clayton said. It was not a question. "The kind that has to do with reputation." Kimball smoothed his coat. "Your reputation specifically. There are men who feel that the time you've been spending with her, given the circumstances of the Brand investigation, is creating an impression that could be damaging." "Damaging to what?" "To your leadership of this association." Lane said it plainly. He had always been the most direct of the three, which Clayton had respected until this moment when the directness was being aimed at someone else's character. "Harlan has raised concerns about whether your judgment in the Ellison matter is being influenced by personal attachment rather than business sense." "Harlan has raised concerns," Clayton repeated. "He has the association's interests at heart," Pruitt said. "As do we all. The railroad contract is significant. The last thing any of us needs is for an investigation into a rustling widow to compromise. She's not a rustling widow." Clayton's voice was very calm. He had a particular way of being calm that tended to stop conversations, and it stopped this one. "She is a woman whose dead husband was manipulated into participating in an operation he tried to exit, and who has spent 2 years managing a working farm alone, while the man actually responsible for the stolen cattle used her proximity to the evidence as a deflection. That is the accurate description of the situation." The 3 men exchanged a look. Clayton Kimball said carefully, "Harlan has been your broker for 11 years. "He has." "The railroad contract was largely his arrangement." "It was." "And you're willing to throw that aside over a widow who has been under suspicion since." "I'm willing to follow the evidence," Clayton said, "wherever it leads. That is the job of the man who leads this association. If any of you have forgotten that, I'd suggest the next 2 weeks would be a good time to remember it." He left them standing and walked to his horse and rode home, and the whole way home he was calculating. Not the situation with the association, he had handled the association, but Harlan's timing. Harlan had moved to use the association against Clayton at exactly the moment when the shipping record comparison was nearly complete. Which meant Harlan knew or suspected how close they were. Which meant Fowler had talked to someone between Clayton's conversation with him and Friday. He rode directly to Nora's. She opened the door before he knocked, which meant she had seen him coming and had already read something in the speed of his approach. "What happened?" she said. He told her about the stockyard conversation. She listened without interrupting, and when he finished, she was quiet for a moment. That was not uncertainty, but processing. "He's trying to isolate you," she said. "If he can get the association to pressure you away from me, the investigation stops. You're the only one with access to the shipping originals. Without those, the ledger alone isn't enough." He knew it. She knew it. "How close are you to having the comparison complete?" "I need 2 more days with the Northeast records." "You have one." She looked at him without flinching. "Then I'll need to work through the night. I'll have Abel bring the Northeast box to your gate this evening. Clayton." She said his name with a weight she hadn't given it before, a weight that was not soft, but was not hard either. It was the weight of someone who is trying to say something true and is deciding whether to say it directly or carefully. She chose directly. If Harlan moves to have me brought before the association formally, before we're ready, there is nothing in that room that will believe me over him. Not without Fowler. Not without a clean chain of evidence. I know. And if you defend me publicly, before we have the evidence, you give him exactly the story he's building. The powerful man made foolish by a widow. The compromised leader. He needs that story. Don't give it to him. He looked at her steadily. What are you asking me to do? Stand beside me at the right moment, not before it. She held his gaze. I don't need you to rescue me. I need you to wait until I've built something worth standing next to. There was something in that sentence that struck him somewhere below the level of logic, the part of a man that has spent years protecting something he was afraid to lose, suddenly recognizing that kind of fear from the outside. All right, he said. The northeast box was at her gate before sundown. The lamp in her kitchen window burned until 2 in the morning. Clayton checked it twice during his own overnight survey of the South Range, both times telling himself he was checking the range, and both times knowing he was checking the light. Friday came. Abe Fowler appeared at Long Spur's gate at 8 in the morning, hat in both hands, with the expression of a man who has spent 3 days arguing with himself and has arrived at a conclusion he doesn't love but can live with. Clayton brought him inside and let him talk, and Fowler talked for nearly an hour, and what he said matched the ledger and the receipt book and the shipping records with the kind of precision that only comes from a person who was actually present. He described the first authorization. He described the system Harlan used to create the timing gaps. He described 3 specific occasions when he had personally witnessed Harlan instructing Daniel Ellison on how to process the altered brands through the routing paperwork, and he described Daniel Ellison's last visit to the stockyard, 5 days before the riding accident. Daniel had come alone without announcing himself, and he had asked Fowler quietly, standing behind the scale house where they couldn't be seen from the road, whether Fowler would testify to what he'd witnessed if Daniel brought a formal complaint to the association. Fowler had been too frightened to say yes. He went to Harlan after, Fowler said. His voice was flat, with the particular flatness of shame that has been living in a person a long time. I don't know what was said. 3 days later, Daniel Ellison was dead. He looked at his hands. I've told myself for 2 years that I don't know whether those things are connected. Do you believe they're not? Clayton asked. Fowler said nothing, which was its own answer. I need you to put what you've told me in writing, Clayton said. Signed. Witnessed. If you do that, Harlan's shipping books become irrelevant to proving the core operation. You were there. You saw it. A living witness changes everything about what the association can ignore and what it can't. Fowler looked at him for a long moment. You understand he'll come after me. He'll try, Clayton said. But a man trying to discredit a witness is a man who has already lost the argument. The question is whether you give us the best possible version of what you witnessed before he has the chance to try. Fowler spent another 40 minutes with Long Spur's foreman and a notary that Clayton had asked to be present without explaining why. He produced a signed and witnessed statement that was 4 pages long and specific enough that a lawyer would have wept with gratitude. Clayton sent for Nora immediately. She arrived in under 20 minutes, which told him she had been waiting for the word. She read Fowler's statement, standing at the kitchen table, moving through it, quickly checking dates and names against the notes she had brought with her, the final comparison from the Northeast records completed in the pre-dawn hours. When she finished, she set the papers down. It matches, she said. Down to the tag numbers. Down to the tag numbers. She looked up. We have it. The full chain. Fowler's testimony. Daniel's coded record, the receipt book from the Hartley pen, and the shipping comparison. She paused. There's only one gap. The forged pages, Clayton said. Someone broke into my farmhouse last month, she said. I didn't tell you. He stilled. When? 4 weeks ago, the night after I first told you about the ledger. I thought it was opportunism, someone who heard about the investigation and wanted to see what I had. She met his eyes. But 2 of the coded pages are missing. The ones that document the transition period when Daniel shifted from participant to witness. If those pages are missing from the record, the story of Daniel's involvement looks different. more deliberate, more sustained. He took them to use them, Clayton said, not to destroy them, to deploy them. When the time is right, when there's maximum damage. She folded her hands on the table. Which means they'll surface, probably at the association meeting, probably alongside a claim that I planted false evidence to protect Daniel's reputation at your expense. Clayton sat with this for a moment. The precision of it. Harlan had been planning for a confrontation that he expected to control, and he had positioned his pieces carefully. The missing ledger pages were not a loose end. They were a loaded weapon aimed at the moment when everything else was already in play. Then we have to be in that room first, Clayton said, with everything we have organized and ready before he introduces the pages. We have to be faster than him. Yes. She looked at the Fowler statement, the receipt book, her own meticulous notes. She looked at him. 10 days, she said. That's what we have. Then we use all 10 of them. She didn't nod. She just picked up the nearest document and started writing, and Clayton pulled the opposite chair out and sat down and opened his own notes, and outside the afternoon light stretched long and golden across the property line between their lives, and neither of them acknowledged it because there was work to do and only 10 days to do it in. But when Abel came to the kitchen door an hour later and stopped and looked at the two of them bent over the same table in the same light, working from the same stack of papers, he had the expression of a man who has just seen something that answers a question he had been asking quietly for a long time. He set down the water pitcher and withdrew without saying a word. And that night, when Nora finally drove her wagon back across the road to her own gate, she found something on the porch step that hadn't been there when she left. The broken step, the one she'd been meaning to fix since April, the one she'd been stepping around every morning and evening, had been repaired. Clean lumber, properly notched, sanded smooth at the edges. No note. No indication of who had done it or when. She stood and looked at it for a long moment. Then she went inside without saying anything to the empty house, because there was no one in it to say anything to, and the feeling that fact produced in her chest was one she hadn't felt in a long time, and was not entirely sure she was prepared to manage. The next morning, before the sun was fully up, she left a cup of coffee at her gatepost and went back inside. Clayton found it during his pre-dawn patrol of the South Range. He drank it standing at her fence line in the early dark, and it was the best cup of coffee he'd had in years, and he did not examine too carefully what that meant. 3 days before the association meeting, the missing ledger pages reappeared. They were found inside Clayton's ranch office, not hidden, not incidental, but placed deliberately on top of his main desk, where he would find them immediately. The entries appeared to be in Daniel's handwriting, and on the surface, they told a story of sustained and calculated cattle theft, in which Daniel Ellison was the central architect with full knowledge and ongoing intent, and in which the coded notations matched several entries Nora had shared with Clayton during their investigation. But the ink was wrong. Nora knew it before she had read more than 2 lines. The ink color that Daniel used for voluntary transactions was a specific warm brown, slightly reddish, from a particular bottle he'd bought from a supplier in Galveston. These pages used a color that was close but not correct. A cooler shade, slightly more neutral, the kind of difference that was invisible to anyone who hadn't spent weeks studying the original entries in direct comparison. He had someone copy them, she said. Recently, within the last month. Someone who had the original pages to copy from, Clayton said. Yes, they're good. They're very good. She turned a page. But the notch position is wrong on every entry that implicates Daniel specifically. Daniel used a left edge notch for entries made under duress. These use a right edge notch. Whoever copied them either didn't know the system well enough to replicate that detail, or they couldn't risk making it look too perfect. Can you prove it? I need the original ink sample from his supplier. She looked up. If I can get a letter to the Galveston supplier with a sample of both inks, a written statement from them about the composition. How long? A week by mail. We don't have a week. No. Clayton looked at the pages. But we have something else. The copies were made from the originals, which means the originals still exist. And whoever made the copies couldn't have done it alone. In a week, they needed time, they needed privacy, and they needed someone who could replicate Daniel's handwriting closely enough to pass. He looked at her. She looked at him. She, Harlan doesn't write like that, she said. He's educated, but he writes with a heavy press. These letters are formed the way Daniel formed them, the specific habit of his right-hand lean. Who in Cedar Wells knew Daniel well enough and long enough to replicate his handwriting under close observation? The question sat between them like a stone dropped in still water. Nora's face changed. There was a man, she said slowly. A bookkeeper. He worked with Daniel for 2 years at the brokerage. He was let go when Daniel shifted to ranching full-time. His name is... She stopped. Nora. His name is Silas Greer, and he is Harlan Creed's wife's younger brother. The silence that followed was the kind that arrives when the last piece of a very ugly picture settles into place, and the picture is complete. He's been in this from the beginning, Clayton said. He's been in this from before the beginning. She set the forged pages down with a steadiness that cost her something. He helped Daniel set up the original coding system. He was the one who suggested Daniel keep a secondary record for protection, he said. He told Daniel it would be his insurance. Her voice had something in it now that was beyond anger, quieter than anger, the cold, still sound of a person understanding how completely they were deceived. It was never insurance. It was a paper chain, something that could be used against Daniel and against whoever Daniel eventually told when the time came. Clayton looked at her face. He did not offer comfort. He did not reach across the distance between them. He simply stayed where he was present and still, and let her carry what she needed to carry, without trying to lift it from her before she was ready. He trusted Silas, she said. Daniel trusted him. For 2 years. She paused. And I cooked dinner for the man 4 times. We have the receipt book from the Hartley pen, Clayton said. We have Fowler's testimony. We have the shipping comparison. We have your analysis of the original ink and notch system. He kept his voice steady and clear, because what she needed right now was not sympathy, but direction. The forged pages are evidence of tampering, not evidence of guilt. If we walk into that association meeting with everything we have, and present the forgery as part of the documented pattern, as the final piece of a 3-year operation designed to point blame at anyone but Harlan Creed, then those pages work in our favor. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she looked at the pages on the desk, and the expression on her face was one he would remember. The precise moment when grief finishes transforming into resolve. The exact breath where a person stops mourning what was done to them and starts doing what needs to be done about it. Then let's make sure we're ready, she said. And Clayton Barron, who had built Long Spur on the principle that a man never shows what he values most, because showing it gives others something to threaten, felt something in his chest. Make a decision entirely without consulting him. I was in trouble. The specific, irreversible, quietly devastating kind of trouble that had nothing to do with Harlan Creed or stolen cattle or railroad contracts. He looked at the woman across the desk from him. This widow who baked bread while her world collapsed and repaired fences in the heat and told the truth at cost and refused every version of this situation that required her to be less than exactly what she was. He was in very serious trouble, and he had no intention whatsoever of doing anything about it yet. The forged pages sat on Clayton's desk like a declaration of war, and both of them knew that Harlan hadn't placed them there as a mistake. He had placed them there as a message. He knew they were close. He knew they were building something he couldn't afford to let reach the association floor, and he had just told them in the clearest possible language available to a man who operated through proxies and paperwork that he was done waiting for them to make the first move. Clayton sent his 2 most trusted hands to ride a quiet perimeter around the Hartley pen that evening with instructions to watch and say nothing. He sent a second message to Fowler telling him to stay home, stay quiet, and speak to no one until he heard otherwise. Then he rode to Nora's and told her both things, and she listened standing in her kitchen doorway with her arms folded across her chest and the expression of someone receiving information they were already halfway expecting. He's accelerating, she said. Yes. Which means he's not as secure as he wants us to think he is. A secure man doesn't plant forged evidence in someone else's office, Clayton agreed. A secure man lets the other person's mistakes do the work. Harlan's making moves because we've forced him to make moves, and moved men make errors. Or they make desperate ones. She looked at him steadily. There's a difference between an error and a desperate move, Clayton. Desperate moves are faster, and they're messier, and they don't care as much about who gets hurt. He held her gaze. I know. I need you to tell me honestly what you think he's capable of. He was quiet for a moment. Not because he didn't know the answer, but because the answer was the kind that deserved to be said carefully. I think he had Daniel Ellison killed, he said. And I think he's been living with that for 2 years without visible consequence, which means he's made a calculation about what he can and cannot survive. If he's made that calculation once, he can make it again. The kitchen was very still. Then we move faster than he expects, Nora said. Yes. How much of our account is ready to present? Enough. Not everything the ink provenance on the forged pages is still a gap, but enough to put the core operation in front of the association with Fowler's testimony and the shipping comparison and the receipt book from the Hartley pen. He paused. The question is whether enough is sufficient against 11 years of Harlan's relationship with those men. It isn't, she said. Not without something that closes the gap completely. She looked at thinking in the focused way. She had not staring through it, but at it as though the answer were written there in small print she was working to read. The railroad tags, the ones from the Hartley pen. I matched 18 of them to specific entries in Daniel's ledger. But there's a series of 4 tags numbers, 114 through 117, that appear in the ledger without a matching shipment in your Long Spur records, which means they were processed through a different route. Which means they're in Harlan's private shipping books, the ones we don't have access to. She turned back to him. If we could show that those 4 tags appear in his private account under a route that doesn't officially exist, we close the gap. We prove he ran a shadow system alongside the legitimate one. Not just that he altered brands, that he built an entirely separate infrastructure for moving stolen cattle. His private books are at the stockyard office. I know where they are. Nora, I'm not suggesting we steal them. The look she gave him was the particular look of a woman who has anticipated an objection and would like it noted that she finds it slightly insulting. I'm suggesting that his station clerk, Abe Fowler, witnessed transactions that would appear in those books. If Fowler's testimony specifically names the routing code Harlan used for the shadow system, we don't need the books themselves. We just need the code. And then we find one legitimate document, one receipt, one transport manifest, anything filed with the county office that uses that same code. Clayton stared at her. County transport filings are public record. They are. Harlan would never be careless enough to use the same code in a public filing. He wouldn't, she said. But a man who's been running a shadow operation alongside a legitimate one for 3 years eventually gets tired of maintaining 2 separate systems. Daniel noted it in the ledger 3 separate entries, where the routing code bleeds from the shadow column into what should be the clean column. He caught it and flagged it, which is why he flagged it in code. He was showing that the systems were contaminating each other. She picked up the ledger copy she'd made and turned to the flagged entries, and she pointed them out one at a time, and Clayton read them and felt the specific cold clarity of a man who has just watched a problem that seemed impassable reveal a door. If the code appears in a public filing, he said slowly, we don't need his private books at all. We have a public record connecting the shadow system to his legitimate accounts. And that's something the association cannot dismiss as disputed evidence. He looked at her. When did you work this out? Last night, around 1 in the morning. She said it without particular pride, just information. I need access to the county transport filings for the past 3 years. All Northern Route manifests. Those are filed at the county clerk's office. Yes. Which is a public building. Yes. Howe was already reaching for his hat. I'll have Abel ride for them in the morning. He can be back by evening if he leaves before sunrise. Tell him to look specifically for the routing prefix HCN and the variants HCN1 through HCN4. Those are the shadow codes Daniel flagged. How are you still remembering these details at? He glanced at the window. It was past 9 in the evening, and he had no idea how long she'd been working before he arrived. Because they matter, she said simply. He looked at her for a moment. The lamplight her steady hands, the ledger copy open in front of her, the week of accumulated evidence organized in neat stacks on her kitchen table that had once been used for bread and now held the documented record of a conspiracy that had cost her everything and stolen 2 years of her life. "Nora," he said. She looked up. He almost said it then. He was close enough to say it that he could feel the shape of it in his chest, and he made the decision not to, because the timing was wrong, and she was right that the timing mattered, and he had promised himself he would not mistake his own feelings for her benefit. "Abel will leave by 4, he said instead. She nodded. She went back to the ledger. He let himself out. Abel came back the following evening with a leather satchel of county transport manifests going back 4 years, and by the time he handed it to Clayton, it was already dusk, and Clayton wrote it straight to Nora's without stopping at the house. She found it in under 20 minutes. HCN2. A routing prefix that appeared on a county transport manifest, dated 14 months ago, filed as part of a legitimate cattle inspection record, submitted to the Cedar Wells County office. Harlan Creed's signature at the bottom. The prefix in the routing field copied from his shadow system into a public document, because somewhere in the accumulated weight of running 2 systems, simultaneously, someone in his operation had written the wrong code in the wrong column and filed it before anyone caught the error. Daniel had been right. The systems had contaminated each other, and the contamination was on record in a public filing that no one could claim was fabricated. Nora set the manifest down on the table and looked at it for a long time. "We have it," she said. Her voice was quiet, quieter than he expected. "We actually have it." "All of it," Clayton said. "The full chain." She pressed both hands flat on the table and breathed. Just breathed. He watched the tension in her shoulders do something he had never seen it do. In the weeks he'd known her, he watched it release fractionally, the way a rope releases when the weight it's been holding is finally set down. And then before either of them could say anything else useful, she reached across the table and put her hand over his. It was not a romantic gesture. It was the gesture of someone who has been holding something alone for a very long time and has found unexpectedly someone steady enough to touch. It lasted approximately 4 seconds. Then she withdrew her hand and straightened and looked at the manifest. "Association meeting is in 6 days, she said. "We need to organize this into a presentation that takes no more than 30 minutes and leaves no gap for Harlan to insert the forged pages as a rebuttal." "Agreed." His voice came out level. He was proud of that. "I'll have Abel draft the summary of the shipping comparison. You handle the ledger analysis and the ink argument. Fowler's statement speaks for itself." "The county manifest goes last," she said, "after everything else is established, so that when we put it down, there's nothing left to argue." Yes. They worked until midnight, and this time when Nora's lamp burned late, Clayton didn't ride past to check it. He sat at his own kitchen table with his own half of the account and worked through the night himself, and the 40 feet of road between their properties felt both very wide and considerably narrower than it had 3 weeks ago. It was the afternoon of the following day when Harlan arrived at Long Spur uninvited. Clayton heard him coming. Not the hooves, but Abel's voice at the gate, carrying the particular tone of a foreman who is being civil to someone he does not trust, and he put what was on his desk into the bottom drawer and locked it before Harlan reached the porch. Harlan Creed at 48 was a large man who moved like a smaller one, with a deliberate lightness that Clayton had always read as self-control, and now read differently. He came into the office and shook Clayton's hand with the practiced warmth of someone who has never confused warmth for sincerity, and he sat down in the chair across the desk and crossed one leg over the other and looked at Clayton, the way he had looked at him for 11 years, with the benign confidence of a man who believes he already knows how every conversation will end. "Heard you've been spending significant time with the Ellison widow," Harlan said. "I've been investigating the brand alterations," Clayton said, "as is my responsibility as association president, of course." Harlan's voice was patient, the way a man is patient when he is arranging something. "I wanted to talk to you before things get further along. There's going to be a hearing. Some of the association members feel that the situation has moved beyond an internal inquiry and requires a formal public review." "Who called for the review?" "Several members." A small pause. I may have suggested it was appropriate given the evidence that's come to light. The evidence in my office, Clayton said. That appeared there without my knowledge. Harlan looked at him. The benign confidence shifted slightly, not gone, but repositioned the way a man repositions his weight when the ground under him is not quite what he expected. Those pages were found in your possession ranch. I watched you build Long Spur into what it is. I arranged the railroad contract that's going to secure the next decade of everything your father worked for. He leaned forward slightly. I'm trying to protect you from a situation that has gotten complicated. This widow, whatever her intentions are, has put you in a position where your judgment is being questioned. Help me help you. What would helping me look like? Clayton asked. Distance, Harlan said. Let the formal hearing proceed. Let the evidence speak for itself. Step back from your involvement in the investigation and allow the association to manage it without your personal stake making things messy. And if the evidence at the formal hearing condemns the wrong person... Harlan's expression did not change. That more than anything else was the answer. The evidence is what it is, Harlan said. It is, Clayton agreed. It's exactly what it is. Harlan left 20 minutes later, and Clayton watched him go from the porch, and the thing he felt watching the man ride away was not anger exactly, though anger was part of it. It was the specific grief of understanding that something you spent 11 years trusting was never what you believed it was, that the loyalty Harlan spoke about so fluently was a performance he'd been giving for a decade while he built a shadow operation underneath it, and that the performance had been convincing enough that Clayton, who prided himself on reading men accurately, had not seen through it until a widow with a coded ledger opened the right page. He wrote it to Nora's immediately. She read his expression when she opened the door and stepped back to let him in before he said a word. He came to you, she said. He told me to distance myself from the investigation. He called it protecting me. What did you tell him? That the evidence is what it is. She absorbed this. He'll move the hearing up. Now that he knows you're not going to back away, he'll want the formal proceeding before we're ready. I know. Are we ready? Not for everything. Clayton sat down. He had not been invited to sit, and she had not offered it, but she did not remark on it either. And the fact that he could sit uninvited in her kitchen without either of them noting it as unusual was something he filed away in the part of himself that kept track of things that mattered. The ink provenance is still the gap. It won't be, she said. She went to the table and picked up a letter. Esther Bell. She keeps samples of the goods she orders for the mercantile. She ordered a specific batch of Galveston writing ink 2 years ago, and she has the supplier's original documentation in her back room because she keeps everything. I asked her this morning. She found it within the hour. Clayton stared at her. You've already. I've been managing alone for 2 years, Nora said not unkindly. I learned to run several things in parallel. She set the letter down. Esther's documentation describes the ink's composition in the supplier's own language. The warm brown, the slight red undertone. It matches Daniel's original entries precisely. And it does not match the forged pages, which means we have provenance for the original ink without waiting for a letter to Galveston. Esther Bell knew Daniel, Clayton said slowly. She knew him well. She also has no love for Harlan Creed, who undercut her trade goods price 3 years ago and cost her a supplier relationship. Nora's eyes held the smallest trace of something that was not quite a smile, but was its neighbor. I didn't manufacture her willingness. It was already there. Clayton looked at her for a long moment. At the woman who had, while he was sitting across the desk from a man who had deceived him for 11 years, been quietly closing the last gap in their account, with the help of a 61-year-old mercantile owner who kept everything. We're ready, he said. We're ready, she confirmed. And then something changed in the air between them. It was not loud. It was barely anything, in fact, just the silence that follows a shared recognition, the moment when two people who have been running toward the same thing stop running and find themselves standing very close together in the sudden stillness. Nora looked at her hands on the table. Clayton looked at her. And the thing that had been building for 3 weeks through every shared stack of papers, every coffee left at the gate, every repaired fence post and pre-dawn patrol, every moment of watching her carry something heavy with complete quiet dignity reached a point where it stopped being a background fact and became a foreground one. "Nora," he said, "don't." Her voice was not sharp. It was something more difficult than sharp. It was the voice of a person who knows exactly what is coming, and has been dreading it, and has been wanting it simultaneously for long enough that both feelings are completely exhausted. "I'm not going to say something you can't take back on my behalf," he said. "I'm just going to tell you what's true, and then you can do whatever you want with it." She looked up at him. "I have not spent this much time thinking about one person in my adult life," he said. "And I've spent enough of it to know it's not about the case, and it's not about the fence, and it's not about any practical reason I've been finding to ride to this side of the road." The silence was absolute. "Clayton." Her voice broke on the second syllable just barely. "You cannot do this right now. I know the timing is wrong. It's not just the timing." She stood up, and the movement was not angry. It was the movement of someone who needs the distance, who needs to put a few feet between herself and what is being said, because the proximity of it is physically difficult. "My husband is dead. He died because he was involved in the same situation we are standing inside right now. And if Harlan Creed is willing to eliminate the problems in his path..." She stopped. Her jaw tightened. "I will not be the reason something happens to you. You are not responsible for..." "I know I'm not responsible. That is not what I said." She turned to face him. Her eyes were steady, but the steadiness was the effortful kind. "I said I will not be the reason. That is different. That is about what I am willing to carry." She looked at him fully directly the way she had looked at everything in their entire acquaintance without flinching and without softening. "You are the most powerful man in this county. You have a railroad contract and a ranch that employs 31 people and a reputation that took 17 years to build. If Harlan decides you are a problem in the same category Daniel was, and defending me publicly makes you that problem, I know what the risk is. Then don't ask me to watch it happen." They stood on opposite sides of her kitchen in the late afternoon light, and the distance between them was approximately 8 feet, and also considerably more than that. He crossed to where she was standing. He did not touch her. He stopped close enough that she would have to look up slightly to meet his eyes, and she did, because Nora Ellison had never been a person who looked away from things. "Come walk with me," he said quietly. "Not to talk about the case, not to talk about any of this. Just come outside for 10 minutes." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she took her shawl from the hook by the door and went with him. They walked to the fence line between their properties. The evening was coming in from the east, the air cooling at the edges, the way Texas air does in late summer when the heat finally relents after sundown. They stood at the gate, not touching, looking out across the land that had been the backdrop of all of it. The cattle and the brands and the ledger and the case and the slow, undeniable accumulation of trust between two people who had started out as neighbors and ended up as something the language of Cedar Wells didn't have a clean word for. Nora reached out and took his hand. She held it for a moment. Her fingers were work-roughened and steady, and the grip was not tentative. It was the grip of a person saying something true that they do not yet have words for. Then she looked up at him, and she said it in 4 words. "Stop loving me," she whispered. "Please, Clayton, it will cost you everything." He felt the words land in exactly the place she had aimed them. He felt the full weight of what she was asking, not out of cruelty, not out of indifference, but out of the most specific and exhausting kind of love, the kind that spends itself protecting the other person from the consequences of its own existence. He did not pull her close. He did not dismiss what she'd said. He looked at her face, the effort in it, the grief in it, the love in it that she was trying to hand back to him like something she had borrowed and could not afford to keep, and he released her hand gently. "If you want me to stop courting you, I will," he said. "That's yours to decide, but I will not let fear write the end of your story. That belongs to you." He stepped back. "And I need you to know that nothing you have just said changes what I'm going to do at that association meeting." She turned away. Her shoulders were taut, and he could see the effort of the posture, the physical act of holding herself upright against something that wanted to bring her down. "Give me tonight," she said. Her voice was almost steady. "Just tonight. I need to think." "Take whatever you need," he said. He meant it simply, and she heard it simply, and he walked back toward Long Spur and left her standing at the fence with her hand still open at her side, as though she had not quite finished the gesture she'd begun. He had been inside 40 minutes when Abel appeared at the study door, wearing the face he wore when news was bad, and he had taken a moment to decide how to deliver it. "South Range," Abel said. "Harlan's moved up the hearing. It's set for day after tomorrow. Association members have already been notified. There's more." Clayton looked up from his desk. "Someone drove the lower herd," Abel said. 400 head from the southwestern pen. They broke the fence at the creek crossing and the whole lot is moving northeast." He paused. "Toward the Ellison property." Clayton was on his feet before Abel finished the sentence. "The branding shed," he said. "Yes." "Daniel's original records are in that shed." "Yes." They were both already moving. Clayton sent 3 riders ahead at full speed, and followed with Abel and 4 more hands riding hard into the dark, with the sound of the herd building ahead of them. Not a full stampede, but 400 frightened cattle moving fast in one direction, with nothing to slow them. And at the end of that direction was a farmhouse, and a branding shed, and a woman who had spent 2 years protecting the evidence inside it. He pushed his horse to everything it had. Nora heard it before she saw it. The rumble that a person who has worked with cattle learns to identify in the chest before the ears confirm it, the specific low vibration of a large herd moving fast. She came off the porch and looked northeast, and she didn't waste time being afraid. She was already calculating. She knew the lead steer. She knew it the way Daniel had known it, because Daniel had written about that particular animal in the ledger, a steer with a partial left ear and a feeding habit that made it reliable enough to lead from. If you could redirect the leader, you could redirect the herd. She had the wagon hitched in under 4 minutes. She drove straight across the open section of the fence, the section that had been replaced 3 weeks ago, when Clayton fixed the post, the section that opened cleanly onto the wide flat between their properties, and she drove into the path of the herd, with the wagon bell clanging, driving straight at the lead steer's left flank. The steer broke right. The herd followed. She drove the left flank hard, pushing them toward the old sorting pen at the northwest corner of Long Spur's boundary. The bell still going, the team pulling steady. And when Clayton and his riders came up on the right flank 3 minutes later and read what she was doing, they fell into position without discussion and pushed from the right and between Nora in the wagon and 6 Long Spur cowboys on horseback. They turned 400 head and drove them into the sorting pen and got the gate closed as the last animal went through. The silence afterward was the specific silence of a crisis that has resolved at the last possible moment, in which everyone present is still counting what was almost lost. Clayton was off his horse before it fully stopped. He crossed to her wagon in 6 strides. She was still holding the reins. Her knuckles were white. Her hair had come entirely down. She was breathing hard in the specific way of someone who has been operating on pure controlled attention for the last 10 minutes and has just been given permission to stop. "The shed," she said immediately. "Intact," Abel called from the direction of the branding shed. "Nothing reached it." She closed her eyes for 1 second. 1 second. Then she opened them. "He sent the herd," she said, not a question. "Yes." "To destroy Daniel's originals before the hearing." "Yes." She climbed down from the wagon without his help, because she was Nora Ellison, and she did not need help to climb down from a wagon. But when her feet hit the ground and she straightened and looked at him, the mask of controlled composure that she had been maintaining for 3 weeks was showing its age. Not broken, she was not a person who broke easily. But thinner than usual, worn to something more transparent. "He knows we're ready," she said. "He couldn't beat us at the hearing, so he tried to eliminate the evidence." "We need to go inside the shed," Clayton said. "Right now. Whatever Daniel left there, we need to get it documented and witnessed tonight before Harlan makes another move." She turned and walked toward the shed, and he followed, and when she opened the door and they went in together, and she lifted the loose board in the northwest corner that she knew about from a detail in Daniel's final entries, what they found inside changed the weight of everything. The original branding iron. Numbered railroad tags in a leather pouch, numbered 114 through 117, the 4 missing ones the exact sequence she had been searching for. And behind the pouch, folded inside an oilskin wrapper, a handwritten statement in Daniel's own hand, signed and dated 6 days before his death. Naming Harlan Creed, naming Silas Greer, describing the full operation from the beginning, and including the routing code, HCN2, written in Daniel's own careful notation, 3 months before the same code appeared in the county transport manifest. Daniel Ellison had left a confession, not of guilt, of witnessing. He had written down everything he knew and hidden it in the one place he trusted. Nora would eventually look in the one building on her property that contained the other evidence he'd cataloged, because Daniel Ellison, whatever his failures and his compromises and his silence, had loved his wife well enough at the end to try to give her the tools to survive the wreckage of what he'd done. Nora stood with the oilskin wrapper in her hands and read the pages, and she didn't cry, but the thing that happened to her face was more costly than crying. Clayton stood beside her in the dark of the branding shed and said nothing. He let her read. He let her have the full weight of what it was to discover that the man she'd mourned and been angry at and defended and contradicted and grieved again had in the end tried to protect her. When she finished, she folded the pages carefully and held them against her chest for a moment. And that one moment was the most private thing he had ever witnessed from a distance of 3 feet. Then she looked up at him. "We have everything," she said. Her voice was completely steady. "All of it. Everything we need." "We have everything," he confirmed. "The hearing is day after tomorrow." "Yes." She looked at him for one long moment that held the memory of the fence line and her hand in his, and 4 words she had whispered in the gathering dark. "Then we finish this," she said, and the look on her face, the resolve in it, the grief beneath the resolve, and the love beneath the grief. It was the most complicated and human thing Clayton Barron had ever been trusted to witness, and he understood standing in that shed with the smell of old iron and oilskin around them, and 400 saved cattle settling in the pen outside, that whatever came next, he was not going to step back from it. Whatever it cost. He was done stepping back. They spent the night before the hearing at the kitchen table, not talking, not reviewing. By that point, everything that could be reviewed had been reviewed until both of them could have recited it in their sleep, and there was nothing left to add or rearrange or strengthen. The account was complete. The chain of evidence ran from the first altered brand, to Daniel's hidden statement, to Fowler's testimony, to the county manifest, with HCN2 in the routing field, and every link of it was documented and witnessed and ready. So they sat in Nora's kitchen with the lamp between them, and Nora wrote out a clean final copy of her ledger analysis in the careful handwriting she used for things that mattered, and Clayton read through Fowler's statement one final time, not because he needed to, but because he needed something to do with his hands. Outside, Abel had posted 2 men at the shed and 2 at the gate with instructions that were not ambiguous. Nothing moved on either property without being accounted for. At some point after midnight, Nora set down her pen and looked at him across the table. "Whatever happens tomorrow," she said. "It'll hold," he said. "The evidence will hold. I know the evidence will hold." She paused. "I meant whatever happens after tomorrow. Between us." She held his gaze in the steady way she had, the way that always made him feel like the conversation was being conducted at a level slightly more honest than most conversations reached. "I said things at the fence that I meant and didn't mean simultaneously. I want you to know that I know the difference." He looked at her. He did not rush what she was saying by responding too quickly. "You were afraid," he said. "I'm still afraid." Her voice was even. "The fear didn't go anywhere. I just stopped letting it make decisions for me." She looked at her hands for a moment, then back up at him. "I owe you more honesty than I gave you at that fence line." "You don't owe me anything," he said. "You gave me exactly what was true for you in that moment. What was true for me in that moment was that I love you, and it terrifies me," she said simply the way she said everything, without theatrical build-up, without softening, just the fact delivered cleanly. "And that Daniel died, and I survived, and I've spent 2 years not knowing what to do with either of those things." Clayton set Fowler's statement down very carefully. "Nora, I'm not asking you for anything tonight," she said quickly. "I'm not asking you for anything at all. I just didn't want to go into that room tomorrow with you thinking that what I said at the fence was the whole truth." She picked up her pen again. That's all. He looked at her for a long moment. This woman who told the truth the way other people breathed, not because it was easy, but because the alternative was a kind of suffocation she refused to accept. We'll talk after, he said. When the room is done, and Harlan is handled, and you've had a night's sleep that isn't about evidence. She nodded, just once. Then she went back to her clean copy, and he went back to Fowler's statement, and the lamp burned between them until 2 a.m, and neither of them said another word about it, and both of them thought about almost nothing else. The Cedar Wells Cattlemen's Association held its formal hearings in the back room of the county building, a space that held 40 people uncomfortably, and 20 people with the illusion of dignity. By the time Clayton and Nora arrived the following morning, there were 37 people inside, and a crowd at the door that suggested the story had traveled further and faster than even Cedar Wells usually managed. Esther Bell was already seated near the front, her back straight, and her expression the settled composure of a woman who has attended enough difficult events to have stopped finding the atmosphere impressive. She caught Nora's eye when they came in and gave her a look that communicated several things efficiently. Nora gave a small nod back. Clayton filed the entire exchange away as further evidence that women who ran mercantile shops and women who ran farms had developed a communication system considerably more sophisticated than anything available to cattlemen. Harlan was already there. He sat at the front table with Walt Pruitt on one side and Curtis Lane on the other, and he looked at Clayton and Nora's entrance with the specific calm of a man who has looked at things longer than other men and is confident in his own patience. He nodded to Clayton. He did not look at Nora. That deliberate non-look told Clayton everything about Harlan's strategy. He was going to attempt to make her invisible, not attack her directly, but address the association over and around her, as though her presence were a formality, rather than a central fact. It was a move that worked on women who needed other people's acknowledgement to feel real. It was going to be the last mistake Harlan Creed made in Cedar Wells. Walt Pruitt opened the hearing with the businesslike discomfort of a man who has been handed a role he didn't entirely want. He outlined the purpose of formal review of the brand alteration investigation and the evidence surrounding the Ellison property, and he noted that both parties had been given opportunity to present. Harlan spoke first. He had the ease of a man who has given speeches for 30 years and knows exactly how long to pause and where to place his weight. He laid out the surface story cleanly. The brand alterations, Daniel Ellison's documented early involvement, the evidence found in Clayton's office, and the association's obligation to resolve the matter before the railroad contract moved to its next phase. He was careful and thorough, and he never once said anything that was technically untrue, because a man who works through proxies and paperwork understands that the most durable lies are constructed from true statements arranged in the wrong order. When he sat down, several men in the room were nodding. Clayton watched their faces and measured what he was working against, and it was considerable. Then Pruitt looked at Nora. "Mrs. Ellison," he said with the faint awkwardness of a man who had expected to be addressing Clayton. "You may speak." Nora stood. She did not have notes in her hands. She had spent enough time with the evidence that she didn't need them, and she had made the deliberate decision to speak without paper, because a woman reading from pages was easy to dismiss, and Nora Ellison had not spent 2 years surviving in order to be easy to dismiss in the room that mattered most. "My husband made a serious mistake," she said. Her voice carried easily, clearly, without effort. 8 years ago, under financial pressure that I was not aware of at the time, Daniel Ellison agreed to assist Harlan Creed in altering the brands on a small number of cattle for a profit that kept our farm solvent through a difficult season. He was wrong to do it. He knew he was wrong when he did it. And for 5 years after that, Harlan Creed used Daniel's participation as leverage to continue an operation that grew considerably beyond what Daniel had originally agreed to. The room was completely still. "Daniel tried to withdraw," she continued. "He tried 3 times over the course of 2 years, and each time, Harlan reminded him of the documented evidence of his early involvement. So Daniel did the only thing left to him. He started keeping a record, not of his own crimes, of Harlan's. Every altered brand, every shadow shipment, every routing code, every payment. He recorded it in a coded ledger, and he hid the key to that code in a place only I would think to look, and 6 days before his death, he wrote a signed and witnessed statement naming every person involved and describing the full operation from the beginning. She paused. The pause was deliberate and precisely the right length. Daniel Ellison did not die in a riding accident, she said. The room erupted. It took Pruitt 2 full minutes to restore enough order to continue, and during those 2 minutes, Clayton stood at the back of the room, exactly where Nora had asked him to stand, present, visible, not intervening, and he watched her stand at the front of that noise without stepping back an inch. She waited. She let the room be what it needed to be. And when Pruitt finally got it quiet enough, she was still standing in exactly the same place, with exactly the same expression, like a fence post that has weathered a wind that made a great deal of noise and moved nothing. "I have documentation," she said when the room settled. "I have the coded ledger and my analysis of its full contents. I have a signed and witnessed statement from Abe Fowler, who served as station clerk at Harlan Creed's stockyard operation for 8 years and personally witnessed the routing procedures used to move stolen cattle through the northern shipment system. I have the branding equipment and numbered railroad tags recovered from the Hartley holding pen, a pen that Harlan Creed's accounts describe as inactive for 4 years and which contained active equipment and supplies as recently as 8 weeks ago." She set the first set of documents on the table in front of Pruitt, then the second, then the third. Each placement was deliberate, unhurried, the movements of someone who has done the work and is simply showing it. "I have a county transport manifest filed 14 months ago with Harlan Creed's signature containing the routing prefix HCN2, a code used exclusively in the shadow shipping system that Harlan operated alongside his legitimate business. That manifest is a public document. It was filed in this county's own records office." Fourth document, on the table, and I have Daniel's original signed statement, dated 6 days before his death, describing the complete operation and naming every participant. She set the oilskin wrapper down last. "The pages found in Clayton Barron's office," she said, "were forged. The ink does not match Daniel's original entries. The supplier's own documentation describes the specific composition of the ink Daniel purchased, and it does not match the composition visible in the forged copies. The notch coding in the margin is applied incorrectly throughout. Daniel used a left edge notch for entries made under duress. The forged pages use a right edge notch consistently. The forgery was executed by someone who had access to the original pages and to Daniel's handwriting, but did not have full knowledge of the coding system." She looked at Harlan directly for the first time. "That person is Silas Greer, Harlan Creed's brother-in-law, and the man who helped Daniel establish the coding system in the first place." Harlan's face did not change, but his hands did. The fingers of his left hand moved against his knee in a small, involuntary press, and Clayton saw it from the back of the room, and he knew the moment he saw it that Harlan had not expected Silas Greer's name to be in that room today. Pruitt looked at the documents. He looked at Harlan. He looked back at the documents. "Mr. Creed," he said carefully, "do you wish to respond to these specific claims?" Harlan stood. He took his time. He was still the large man who moved like a smaller one, still deliberate, still composed. But something in the composition was different now. The way a wall looks different when you know where the crack is, even if the crack is small. "These are the accounts of a grieving widow with motive to protect her husband's memory," he said. "The ledger is Daniel Ellison's document created by Daniel Ellison, and I have no way to independently verify its contents or the accuracy of the coding analysis she's provided. The Fowler statement comes from a man who was in my employ for 8 years and who has personal reasons to deflect attention from his own role in any irregularities that may have occurred. And the county manifest." He paused, and in the pause was a man searching for ground under a surface that had just shifted. "The county manifest routing prefix is a clerical standard used across multiple operations in this district. It is not proprietary." It was a good response. Clayton had to give him that. It was the response of a man who had been preparing for this conversation for 3 years and had his answers ready. Then the door at the back of the room opened. Abe Fowler walked in. He was wearing his good coat, which was somewhat ill-fitting and clearly not worn often. He held his hat in both hands, the same way he'd held it when he came to Long Spur that Friday morning. He looked at the room with the expression of a man who has arrived somewhere he'd rather not be, and has made his peace with the fact that arriving was necessary. He walked to the front without being asked, and looked at Pruitt. "I have something to add to my written statement," Fowler said, "if you'll allow it." Pruitt looked at the room. The room looked at Pruitt. Nobody objected because objecting would have required a reason, and the only person in the room with a reason to object was Harlan. And Harlan said nothing. "The routing code, HCN2, Fowler said. He spoke slowly and precisely the way a man speaks when he has rehearsed something many times and wants to be certain it comes out correctly. That code was created by Harlan Creed in the spring of 1881. I was present when he wrote it in the margin of his private account book and explained its use to two of his handling men. The N designates the northern shadow route. The 2 designates the second tier of operation cattle, already altered and ready for the secondary inspection. I used that code myself in processing paperwork on 14 separate occasions over 3 years. He paused. It does not appear in any county standard. It does not appear in any district-wide clerical system. It exists in one place, and that place is Harlan Creed's operation. The silence in the room was the kind that lands when a very large thing falls, and the sound of it has finished echoing. Harlan looked at Fowler. For the first time since the hearing began, his composure had a fault line visible in it. Not collapse, not yet. But the face of a man watching the last piece of the structure he built give way. "Abe," he said. His voice was quiet, almost gentle. The voice of a man reminding someone of a relationship they had, trying to invoke it as a stay. "I'm sorry, Harlan," Fowler said. He sounded as though he meant it. "I should have said this 2 years ago." What followed was not a clean resolution. Resolutions in a room full of men who have just learned that someone they trusted has been deceiving them are not clean. They are loud and contentious, and they move through several stages of denial before they reach something like acceptance, and that process took the better part of 2 hours, and involved Pruitt gaveling for order more times than was dignified, and Kimball changing his position 3 times in 90 minutes, and Curtis Lane sitting in rigid silence with the expression of a man realizing that his 15-year social relationship with Harlan Creed was going to require significant reassessment. But the evidence was what it was. Nora had said as much, and she was right. By the time the afternoon had moved into early evening, the association had voted to suspend Harlan's membership and refer the full account to the county sheriff for criminal investigation. Pruitt had sent a rider to the sheriff's office before the vote was finished. Harlan was escorted from the room by 2 men who had voted for him to lead the association the previous spring. He did not look at Nora when he left. He looked at Clayton once from across the room, and the look contained many things: recrimination, grudging assessment, the expression of a man who had underestimated something and knew precisely what it had cost him. Clayton looked back at him steadily and said nothing. The room was still processing itself when Esther Bell appeared at Nora's elbow, pressed her hand firmly once and said, "Good girl," in the tone of a woman who has been waiting a long time to say something and has finally gotten the occasion for it. Clayton crossed the room to where Nora was standing when most of the others had cleared out. She was still at the front table, organizing the documents back into their proper order, with the methodical care she gave everything, and she did not look up when she heard him approach. "It held," he said. "It held." She kept sorting. Her hands were steady. She had kept her composure through 2 hours of contentious deliberation, and she was not going to surrender it now by letting the relief make her unsteady. But he could see in the slight difference in her breathing that the steadiness was the hard-earned kind. "Daniel's statement made the difference," Clayton said. "Not the manifest, not Fowler, not the receipt book. When they read his actual words, his own account, that was the moment the room changed." She stopped sorting. She was quiet for a moment. "He tried," she said. It was not a defense of him and not an indictment. It was the simplest and most complete thing she could say about a man who had made serious mistakes and spent the last years of his life trying to correct them. It wasn't enough to save himself, but it was enough for this. Clayton picked up the stack she'd been organizing and held it while she closed the leather case. A small, practical thing. She accepted it without comment, the way she had accepted every practical thing he'd done in the last 3 weeks, without performance, without deflection. Just the natural ease of someone who has stopped needing to manage the distance between them. They walked out of the county building into the early evening, and Cedar Wells was doing what Cedar Wells did, which was processing information at speed and volume through every available channel. People on the street looked at them. Some nodded. A few looked away. Esther Bell was already at the mercantile door talking to 3 women who were doing the thing where they appear to be discussing something else while actually discussing the thing everyone is discussing. "She'll have the full account distributed by morning," Nora said. "Before morning," Clayton said. They walked to where the horses were hitched and stood for a moment in the particular silence of 2 people who have just survived something together and have not yet figured out what to do with the surviving. "The association will need a new broker," Clayton said. "Yes." "And the railroad contract review is in 3 weeks." "Yes." "I'm going to propose a public brand registry," he said. "Every registered brand in the county, publicly recorded, open access. So that what Harlan did running altered brands through a system that only he and a handful of men could verify becomes impossible to repeat." He paused. "I'd like you to manage the records." Nora turned to look at him. "I'm not offering it as a kindness," he said immediately, because he knew she would need to hear that distinction. "I'm offering it because you know Daniel's system better than anyone alive, which means you understand brand fraud at a level nobody else in this county does, and the registry needs someone with that specific knowledge to be credible." He held her gaze. "It's a paid position. It doesn't require you to give up the farm. It doesn't require you to give up anything." She looked at him for a long moment. "You've been thinking about this for a while," she said. "Since the 2nd week," he said. She looked at him a moment longer. Then she looked at the road ahead, and whatever she was looking at in her own mind took a few seconds to resolve, and when she turned back to him, something in her face had shifted into a quieter register, not soft, but settled. "Yes," she said. "I'll manage the records." He nodded. He did not let the relief show, though it was considerable. They rode back to Cedar Wells together. And when they reached the point where the road divided between Long Spur and the Ellison property, they both slowed without speaking. "The sheriff will be at Harlan's by morning," Clayton said. "I know. It's over. Most of it." She looked at him. "The official part." I understood what she meant. He had promised her they would talk after the room was done, and Harlan was handled, and she'd had a night's sleep. The room was done. Harlan was handled. The night's sleep was still ahead, which technically meant he had honored the condition. "I'll come by tomorrow," he said. "Not about evidence." "I know," she said. And the way she said it told him she was not asking him not to. She rode her side of the road home. He rode his. But he watched her go until she was through her gate and the lamp came on in her kitchen window at the usual time. And that night, for the first time in 3 weeks, he did not feel the need to check it, because it was simply there, burning steadily in the dark, the way it always was, the way it always would be. The weeks that followed moved with a different rhythm than the weeks before. The sheriff arrested Harlan Creed on a Thursday, which was satisfying, and arrested Silas Greer on the following Monday, which was more complicated because Silas Greer was frightened and cooperative in the way that frightened and cooperative men are. And his testimony about the specifics of the forgery operation added detail to the county's case that sealed it more completely than any single piece of evidence had managed alone. The cattle were recovered over the course of 2 weeks, identified through Daniel's records and the railroad tags and the now public routing codes that Fowler's testimony had decoded. Long Spur's count came in full, the contract review proceeded, and the railroad representatives who came out to inspect the operation in late August found a ranch whose records were clean and whose president was calm, and whose brand documentation was organized with a precision that one of the representatives described with visible approval as exemplary. Clayton did not mention that the precision was largely owed to the woman who had spent 2 weeks at his shipping records table, cross-referencing dates. He told Nora about it over coffee at her kitchen table, and she gave him the look that was almost a smile, and he decided that look was worth the railroad contract, which was considerable. The brand registry opened on a Tuesday in early September. Nora organized the inaugural registration day with the same systematic thoroughness she brought to every task, and by mid-afternoon, she had processed 41 brand registrations from ranchers who ranged from Long Spur's scale down to families running fewer than 20 head on small properties that had never had the leverage to protect their marks against larger operations. 3 women came alone, widows like herself, managing property they had inherited or built without partners. She processed their registrations with the same care she gave every other, and when the last one left, she sat for a moment in the office that had once been the Ellison branding shed, and felt something she had not felt in 2 years. It was not happiness exactly. It was more specific than happiness. It was the feeling of a person who has found the right-sized work for their particular abilities, and is doing it in a place that belongs to them, and who has done something today that will continue after today is over. Clayton appeared in the doorway at closing time. He had developed the habit of appearing in her doorways, and she had developed the habit of not remarking on it, and together they had quietly agreed that this habit would continue. "How many?" he said. 41. She organized the last registration papers. 3 of them had marks that would have been vulnerable under the old system, no official documentation easily contested. They're protected now. Because of the registry. Because of the registry. She looked up. "Thank you for the position." "Thank you," he said, "for making it worth the proposition." She stood and reached for her coat, and he held it for her. A small, easy thing that he had started doing recently, and that she had started accepting without either of them deciding it was a habit, and they walked out together into the early fall evening that had in the last 2 weeks begun to carry the first edge of actual coolness. They walked to the fence line. The shared fence line, the one that had started this whole thing when a rotten post gave way, and 14 Long Spur cattle pushed through and were calmly sorted by a widow in a pale blue dress who already knew more about the situation than anyone had given her credit for. Clayton had installed a gate in the fence the previous week. Not a gate that connected their properties in any official or permanent sense. Just a simple wooden gate, hinged properly with a latch that either of them could open from either side. He hadn't made a ceremony of it. He had installed it in the morning while she was at the shed, and when she came back and saw it, she had stood looking at it for a long moment without speaking, and then she had gone inside, and he had gone back to Long Spur, and neither of them had discussed it, because it was the kind of thing that did not require discussion. Now she stood at that gate and looked at him. "I need to tell you something," she said. "Tell me. I visited Daniel's grave this week." She said it with the directness she used for things that had been privately significant and were now ready to be shared. "I'd been putting it off. I told myself it was because I was busy, which was true, but not the real reason." She paused. "The real reason was that I didn't know how to stand at a dead man's grave when I was falling in love with a living one." Clayton was very still. "I stood there for a long time," she said. "And I thought about what I actually believe about grief, which is that it doesn't end. It just changes shape. And what I believe about love, which is that it isn't a finite thing that you run out of when you spend it. And what I believe about loyalty, which is that honoring someone who is gone doesn't require surrendering what's still present." She met his eyes. "I believe Daniel would have wanted me to be honest about what happened, about what he did wrong, about what he tried to do right." She paused. "And I think he would have wanted me to stop standing at fences asking people to stop loving me when what I actually want is for them to come through the gate." Clayton looked at her for a long, full moment. Then he said, "A rancher named Derek Hollis called you my weakness in front of 3 association members at the harvest gathering this morning." She blinked. "What did you say?" "I told him he was wrong." His voice was quiet and clear. "I told him you were the reason I finally understood that power without trust is only fear with a better hat." She made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was its near relation. And then something in her face let go. Not the composure, not the steadiness, but the effort that had been holding itself in front of the steadiness, the barrier she had been maintaining between what she felt and what she permitted herself to feel. And without that barrier in place, her face was just her face, open and real and tired, in the good way of someone who has put down a weight they've been carrying for too long. "Court me then," she said. "Openly, the way you asked." He looked at her steadily. "You're certain?" "I was certain 3 weeks ago." She held his gaze. "I was just afraid, which is different from uncertain, and I have decided to stop letting the fear vote." He reached across the gate and took her hand. Not the careful, brief grip of the fence line moment. This was different. This was a man taking a woman's hand with the full intention of not letting go of it prematurely. Holding it with the deliberate warmth of someone who has been patient for precisely the right amount of time and is now done being patient. "I'm going to court you properly," he said. "Church and company and introductions and all of it. Not because Cedar Wells requires it. Because I require it," she said. "Because you require it," he agreed. "And because you deserve to be chosen in daylight in front of people without any ambiguity about what I mean by it." She looked at him with the open face that had let go of its barrier, and the expression in it was the most honest and complicated and quietly joyful thing he had seen since the morning. 14 cattle pushed through a rotten fence post, and he had ridden over expecting to manage a problem, and found instead a woman who had already managed it. "You were supposed to ride over that morning and fix the fence and go home," she said. "I know." "That was all it was supposed to be." "I know." He held her hand at the gate between their properties, and the evening light moved across both pieces of land, the way it did at this hour, equally, with no preference for one side of the fence over the other. The fence post had other ideas. She looked at the gate. She looked at him. And then Nora Ellison, who had baked bread while her world collapsed and told the truth at cost, and stood in front of a room full of skeptical men, with 2 years of work in her hands, and not one tremor in her voice, laughed genuinely and completely laughed for the first time since Clayton Barron had known her. It was, he thought, the finest sound he had heard in 36 years of living. He intended to hear it as frequently as possible for the rest of his life, and he was the kind of man who, when he made an intention, saw it through. Clayton courted Nora Ellison the way he did everything, with complete intention and zero performance. He did not send flowers because Nora had once said in passing that cut flowers were a beautiful way to watch something die on a table, and he had filed that away with the same attention he gave everything she said that revealed something true about her. Instead, he showed up on Sunday mornings to drive her to church in the good wagon with the clean harness, and he sat beside her in the third pew from the front where she always sat, and he stood when the hymns required standing, and sat when they required sitting, and contributed nothing to the elaborate social theater that occurred in the churchyard afterward, except his physical presence at her side, which was in Cedar Wells in September of 1884, a statement that required no elaboration. Cedar Wells elaborated anyway. Cedar Wells was constitutionally incapable of leaving a statement alone. Esther Bell told anyone who asked, and several people who didn't, that it was the most sensible development she had witnessed in 30 years of watching this town make its romantic decisions, the majority of which she considered catastrophically ill-considered. Walt Pruitt shook Clayton's hand after the second Sunday, and said with the gruff approval of a man who has revised an opinion and is slightly embarrassed about the revision, "She's a good woman." Clayton thanked him without elaborating on how thoroughly he already knew that. 3 association members made comments that were not approving. Clayton addressed each one the same way, directly, calmly, with the specific brevity of a man who has decided a thing and does not require other people's comfort to maintain the decision. The comments stopped within a week. This was the advantage of 17 years of building a reputation when you spent it on something people noticed the spending. Nora managed the registry, Monday through Friday, and her farm the rest of the time, and she did not scale back either endeavor, because both mattered to her, and she was fully capable of doing both. Clayton rode past the brand office on his way to the stockyard, often enough that Abel mentioned it once with complete neutral innocence, that the stockyard route seemed to have shifted north recently. Clayton said nothing in response, which was itself a response, and Abel filed it under the large and growing category of things he had decided not to remark on. The courtship proceeded with a rhythm that suited them both, practical, present, honest. Clayton stopped by the office at the end of her working days, and they went over registry business that was genuinely interesting to him, and not at all a pretext because Nora had organized the system with an intelligence that made it worth discussing. She came to Long Spur twice a week to work with the updated shipping records, and those evenings sometimes ended with dinner at the kitchen table, with Abel and two of the senior hands, easy and unforced, and sometimes ended with just the two of them on the porch in the cooling dark, talking about nothing in particular and everything important. He did not rush her. She did not rush herself. They had both spent enough of their lives inside situations they couldn't control to recognize the value of something that moved at its own honest pace. What neither of them expected was the letter. It arrived on a Wednesday in the third week of September, addressed to Nora at the Brand Registry office, postmarked from Austin. The return address was a law firm. She opened it at the office desk and read it twice before she sent for Clayton, which told him when he arrived and saw her face that it was not a simple matter. "Harlan's attorneys," she said. She handed him the letter. He read it. His jaw tightened slightly at the third paragraph and did not release until he finished. Harlan Creed, through his legal representation, was asserting that Daniel Ellison's estate, including the Ellison farm property, was liable for restitution related to the early cattle alterations in which Daniel had participated. The claim argued that because Daniel had profited from the early operations, the profit had been used to sustain the farm, and therefore the farm itself was a product of fraudulent gain and subject to seizure as part of the restitution process. It was a thin argument. Clayton could see the thinness of it clearly. But thin arguments filed through proper legal channels required responses through proper legal channels, and legal channels cost money and time, and a woman running a farm and a registry office on a modest income did not have unlimited reserves of either. He set the letter down. "He's going after the farm," he said. "He's going after the farm," she confirmed. Her voice was even, but her hands were not. She had folded them on the desk in that deliberate way she had when she needed them to behave. "It's a weak claim," he said. "Daniel's early involvement predated the farm property. You bought that land with a legitimate inheritance from your mother. The timeline doesn't support the liability argument." "I know." She met his eyes. "But proving that requires a lawyer. A good one. In Austin, probably. I know a lawyer in Austin." "Clayton, before you tell me you don't want my money," he said, "let me tell you that this is not a gift, and it's not charity, and it is not me attempting to solve your problems with my bank account. It is me proposing a specific legal strategy that I have an existing relationship to execute, and if you want to tell me why that's unacceptable, tell me the actual reason and we'll address it." She looked at him. He looked at her. This was one of the things about them that worked the complete absence of performance in either direction. She didn't pretend not to need the help. He didn't pretend the help was purely altruistic. "The actual reason," she said carefully, "is that I don't want to become a woman who is managed, who has her problems solved for her by someone with more resources and slowly loses the habit of solving them herself." "That's a legitimate reason," he said. "Here's my answer to it. I'm not solving this problem. You've already identified the core defense, the inheritance timeline. What you need is someone with a law license to make that argument in a room I can't enter on your behalf. Hiring the lawyer is logistics. The legal reasoning is yours." He paused. "Is that a meaningful distinction?" She thought about it honestly, which was the only way she thought about anything. "Yes," she said. "It is." "Then let me send the letter to James Howell in Austin today, and you write out the inheritance documentation and the farm purchase records, and we give him everything he needs to end this before it costs Harlan's attorneys more than it costs us." She picked up the letter from the desk and looked at it once more. Then she set it down and reached for her pen. "Tell me what Howell needs," she said. They had the documentation assembled and sent by Friday. James Howell's response came back the following Wednesday, and it was brisk and confident in the way of a man who has looked at a legal argument and found it somewhat insulting to his time. The inheritance timeline was airtight. The liability claim had no foundation that would survive a county court review, let alone a state one. He recommended a formal response letter citing 3 specific precedents, which he drafted and sent to the opposing counsel within the week. The claim was withdrawn before the end of October. Nora read the withdrawal notice standing at the registry office desk, and the expression that moved across her face was not triumph. It was something quieter and more durable than triumph. The expression of a person for whom the last outstanding threat has been closed, and who is for the first time in 2 years genuinely looking at a future with nothing actively working to take it from them. She sat down. She put the notice on the desk. She looked at her hands for a moment. Then she looked up at Clayton, who had come by at the end of the day in his reliable way, and she said, "It's over." "All of it," he said. "All of it." She was quiet for a moment. "I don't entirely know what to do with that." "You don't have to do anything with it today." "No." She folded the notice and put it in the desk drawer. "But I know what I want to do with tomorrow." He waited. "I want to talk to you about something," she said. "Not about evidence or legal claims or the registry." She met his eyes directly. "About what comes next, for us, specifically." "I'll come by tonight," he said. "Come for dinner," she said. 7 o'clock. He came at 7, and she had cooked a real dinner, not the bread and coffee practicality of their working evenings, but actual food with care put into it, and the table set properly. And it was the most domestic and deliberate invitation she had ever extended to him, and they both understood what it meant without saying so. They ate, and they talked, the way they always talked. And after dinner, when the dishes were done in the efficient way that two practical people do dishes together, when neither of them has any interest in performing domesticity, they sat at the table with coffee, and Nora folded her hands on the surface and looked at him. "I want to be married," she said. "I want to marry you specifically. I've known that for a while, and I've been waiting until all the other things were settled before I said it, because I didn't want the statement to be contaminated by circumstance." She paused. "The circumstances are settled, so I'm saying it." Clayton looked at her across the table. The lamplight, the empty coffee cups, the woman who proposed marriage the way she did everything directly, practically, without ornamentation, with the full weight of her honest intention behind every word. "I've been working up to asking you," he said. "I know you have. You were doing it carefully." She looked at him with the slight expression that lived near a smile. "I'm not a careful person generally. I decided to just say it." "I know you're not." He held her gaze. "Yes," he said. "Absolutely, and without reservation, yes." She breathed. A single breath, the specific release of someone who has said the true thing and heard the true answer. Then she reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. "I keep my farm," she said. "Of course." "And the registry position." It was never conditional. "And I keep Daniel's photograph, the one from our first year." He looked at her carefully. "Nora, I would never ask you to. I know you wouldn't. I'm telling you anyway because I want it said clearly. I'm not erasing him. I'm not pretending the marriage didn't exist, or that it wasn't real, or that what happened to him didn't happen." Her voice was and specific. "I loved him. He failed me in some significant ways, and he tried to make it right in the end, and I've made my peace with all of it. You are not a replacement for him. You are a completely separate and distinct choice that I am making with my eyes open." "I understand that," Clayton said. "I don't want to replace anyone. I want to be chosen by you as myself, for myself." He paused. "And I want to choose you the same way." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded once, the decisive nod that meant she had arrived at the end of a consideration and was satisfied with where it had landed. "Then we're agreed," she said. "We're agreed." They were married in the first week of October outdoors, between the cottonwoods at the shared boundary, because the gate in the fence was where they had arrived at all the important conclusions, and it seemed right to arrive at this one in the same place. Esther Bell cried enthusiastically and without apology. Abel McRae did not cry, but stood with the expression of a man whose long-held private hope has been publicly confirmed, which was its own kind of satisfaction. 20 people attended, which was the right number, enough to make it witnessed and real, not so many that it became a performance. Nora wore the cream-colored dress that Esther had helped her choose, made to fit her exactly and flatter her completely, and she walked to the cottonwoods without being escorted, because she had been her own escort for 2 years and had decided there was no reason to change that on this particular morning. Clayton was waiting at the gate in his dark western suit with the clean brown boots, and when she came through the gate and stopped in front of him, he looked at her with an expression she had seen from him only a handful of times, the one where he stopped managing his face and let it say what it actually meant. What it said was here. Finally. Here. The ceremony was brief and honest. The words they exchanged were not elaborate because neither of them needed elaborate, and the officiant, a man who had known Clayton since childhood and had witnessed the evidence presentation at the association hearing from the second row, seemed to understand that what was happening in front of him was the conclusion of something significant and needed no additional ornamentation. When it was done, Esther hugged Nora with the full enthusiasm of a woman who has been invested in an outcome and has seen it arrive. Abel shook Clayton's hand with both of his, which was as expressive as Abel got, and was therefore equivalent in emotional volume to another man weeping openly. The weeks after the wedding moved into the kind of rhythm that builds itself from two lives, finding the shape they fit together. Not seamlessly, two people with strong opinions and established habits and independent working lives do not fit together seamlessly, and any account that says otherwise is not an honest account. They disagreed about the registry filing system twice. Clayton reorganized the kitchen once without asking, which earned him a conversation he did not enjoy and did not repeat. Nora rode into town alone at hours. He considered inadvisable given the road conditions and did not alter this practice despite his stated opinion on the road conditions. But the disagreements were the disagreements of two people who respected each other enough to disagree honestly, and they resolved the way honest disagreements resolve through direct conversation. Some adjustment on both sides, and the occasional acceptance that the other person was simply going to do the thing their own way, and that was the nature of having married someone with a functioning spine. The thing that held was not the absence of friction. The thing that held was the honesty underneath the friction, the bedrock agreement between them that the truth mattered more than comfort, and that neither of them would pretend otherwise to keep the peace. Harlan Creed's trial was held in Austin in November. Nora testified. She did not ask Clayton to accompany her, and he did not insist, because she had earned the right to walk into that room on her own feet and deliver her account in her own voice, without his presence implying that she required support to do it. He was in Cedar Wells when she came back waiting at the gate, the way he had developed the habit of waiting. "Guilty," she said when she came through. "On all counts, fraud, theft, conspiracy." She paused on the path and looked at him. "And Daniel's death." The jury found the evidence sufficient. He watched her face move through something complex and private. The grief of it was still real. Daniel had been her husband, and the confirmation that his death was deliberate was not a thing that resolved cleanly, regardless of how prepared she had been for the verdict. He let her have the complexity. He did not try to simplify it into something easier to look at. She came to him, and he put his arms around her, and she stood there for a moment, with her face against his shoulder, and did not speak. And he did not speak either, because some things do not improve with words, and the recognition of that is its own kind of love. After a moment, she straightened. She wiped her eyes with the practical efficiency of a person who has given grief its moment and is now returning to the world. "It's done," she said. "It's done," he agreed. She looked at the gate between the properties. The simple wooden gate that had become in the months since he installed it, the place where all the significant things between them seemed to occur. She looked at the two pieces of land on either side of it, hers and his, both operating and productive and unmistakably separate, even as they were irrevocably connected. "I want to expand the registry," she said. She wiped the last of the tears away, and her voice had already returned to its normal register. "There are 3 counties to the north that have no formal brand recording system. If we proposed a regional registry, something that operates independently of the Cattlemen's Association, funded by registration fees rather than membership dues, it would protect small operators who can't afford association membership." He looked at her. "You've been thinking about this for a while." "Since August," she said. "I was waiting for everything else to settle." "Have you drafted the proposal?" "I've been drafting it for 6 weeks." He looked at her for a moment, with the expression she had put on him several times now. The specific look of a man who is encountering someone's full capability and finding it genuinely extraordinary every time. "Show me tonight," he said. I will. She moved toward the house. I'm making dinner first. What are you making? Bread, she said. And everything else. He followed her inside, and the gate stood open behind them. In the last light of the afternoon, open on both sides the way it had been since he installed it, and the way it would remain. December arrived with the first real cold of the season, and Cedar Wells pulled itself inward, the way small towns do when the weather gives them reason to stay close and warm and domestic. The registry was busy. More registrations came in from outlying properties, as word spread that the system was thorough, and its administrator was not interested in favoring large operators over small ones. Nora processed every application with the same careful attention, and the waiting list for appointments was 6 weeks long before November ended. Clayton proposed the regional registry expansion to the county commissioners in the second week of December, with Nora's proposal document as the foundation and her name on the cover as its author. 2 commissioners approved it immediately. The third required 3 additional meetings. By Christmas, the funding structure was in place. On the evening of this day, the final approval came through. Nora stood on her porch, their porch now, though she still thought of it sometimes as hers. And he never corrected her on this, because he understood the distinction mattered, and watched the last of the light move across the land. Clayton came out and stood beside her. Not behind her, not in front of her, but beside her at the same height, looking in the same direction, at the same view. 2 people who had arrived at the same place, through such entirely different roads, that the fact of standing here together was still some mornings astonishing to both of them. She looked at him. He looked at her. The evening quiet settled around them in the way of evenings in October, full of the specific piece of things that have been worth the work. "Do you remember when I told you to stop loving me?" she said. He looked at her. "I remember every word. You were supposed to listen." Her voice had the warmth in it that she kept quiet most of the time, the warmth she had learned to let him hear. He took her hand. Not the fence-line grip, not the across-the-table reach, but the easy, certain hold of a man who has arrived at the place he intended to reach and is not letting go of it. "I listened to your fear," he said. "Then I waited until your heart could speak for itself." She looked at the land spread out before them, both pieces of it, hers and his, joined by a gate and a registry and a marriage, and the accumulated honesty of 2 people who had learned that love without truth is only another kind of loneliness. She leaned into him slightly. He put his arm around her shoulders. They stood like that, as the light continued its long, slow departure from the Texas sky, and neither of them spoke, because everything that needed saying had been said in a coded ledger in a public hearing, at a fence line in the dark, at a kitchen table with coffee going cold between them, and at a gate that stood open on both sides exactly as it should. The most powerful cowboy in Texas once built his entire life around the belief that fear was a reasonable substitute for trust, and that distance from other people was the same thing as safety. He was wrong about both, and it took a widow next door one who baked bread while her world collapsed. Who told the truth when lying would have been easier? Who turned a herd of 400 cattle in the dark with a wagon bell and sheer stubborn nerve to show him the difference? She did not do it by being soft. She did it by being entirely uncompromisingly and magnificently herself every single day, until he could no longer remember what he had been so afraid of, and could not imagine for even a single moment facing the rest of his life, without her standing exactly where she stood now, beside him on her own ground, looking forward.